Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a nice idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I went to the mall after work. I just wanted to grab a few things, nothing major. It wasn't crowded, which was nice. I liked shopping alone, taking my time. There was this store I always stopped by, one of those places that wasn't too expensive but had decent clothes. I picked out a few things and went to the fitting rooms in the back. There were only a few stalls. Just a short hallway, beige carpet, a big mirror on one wall. No other women were around, just the girl at the counter, barely looking up from her phone. She handed me a tag for my items and waved me in. I took the last stall, all the way at the end. I always liked the end stalls. Felt more private. The door was one of those solid ones, not the kind with gaps at the bottom. It had a little lock, just a simple turn knob. I tried on the first shirt. Didn't like it. Moved on to the next one. I was halfway through pulling it down over my head when I heard something. A sound. Small. Quick. I froze. It came from outside the stall. Just a little noise, like fabric shifting. I figured someone else had come in. No big deal. I kept changing. When I was done, I reached for the lock. Turned it. It didn't move. I tried again, harder this time. It barely budged. My fingers slipped. The lock was stuck. I let out a breath, adjusted my grip, and twisted again. Nothing. It didn't even turn halfway. I frowned, feeling a weird little knot form in my stomach, but I told myself it was just old. Maybe jammed. I knocked on the door. "Hey," I said, "I think the lock's stuck." No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. "Hello? Anyone out there?" Then I heard it. Breathing. Right outside the door. It was slow, careful. Not like someone out of breath. Just steady, like whoever was there didn't want me to know they were standing there. I felt my whole body go cold. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, my hand still on the lock. The breathing didn't stop. I swallowed hard and tried the lock again. It moved a fraction of an inch. I twisted with all my strength, feeling my fingertips go sore. It wouldn't turn. I could hear the air moving, just on the other side of the door. Deep, steady breaths. In. Out. In. Out. I pressed my lips together, forcing myself not to panic. I glanced down at the bottom of the stall door. No gap. I couldn't see anything. I knocked one more time, harder. "Hello?" The breathing stopped. Silence. I waited, every second stretching longer than it should. I leaned in a little, straining to hear if they had left, but I couldn't tell. Then, suddenly, the handle moved. Not a little. Not like someone brushing past. It twisted, hard, shaking against the lock. Someone was trying to open it. I yanked back, pressing myself against the wall. My heart pounded so hard I thought I would be sick. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. The handle rattled again. Shaking, jerking. I forced myself to move. I grabbed my bag off the hook and slammed my fist against the door. "Hey!" My voice was loud this time, sharp, I'm in here. Silence again. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. No breathing. No footsteps. Then, the sound of someone walking away. Slow, unhurried. I didn't move. I stood there, my skin cold, waiting. I counted to 10. Then 20. I turned back to the lock. My fingers were shaking, but I gripped it hard and tried again. It turned just a little more. Another twist, and suddenly it clicked. The door swung open. I stepped out fast, looking left, then right. No one was there. The fitting room was empty. The hallway was silent. The only sound was the faint music from the store's speakers. I rushed out, my bag clutched tight in my hand. The girl at the counter was still on her phone, not even looking up. I hesitated for half a second, then walked right past her, out into the store. I didn't stop. I didn't even put the clothes back. I kept going, straight out of the store, into the main mall. People walked past me, talking, laughing, shopping like nothing was wrong. I turned back, looking through the glass storefront. A man stood near the fitting rooms. Not going in. Just standing there, facing the hallway. He wasn't looking at clothes. He wasn't holding anything. I don't know if he saw me leave. I don't know if he had been waiting. But I left the mall without buying anything. I got into my car, locked the doors, and sat there until my breathing felt normal again. I don't go to that store anymore. It was around 6:30 in the evening when I heard the knock. 3 solid knocks, evenly spaced. I was in the kitchen, finishing up a late dinner. The sound made me stop mid-bite. I live alone. Been in the same apartment for 3 years, a small place on the 3rd floor. It's nothing fancy, but it's quiet. I don't get visitors. Anyone who comes by is either a delivery guy or someone who has the wrong door. I set my fork down and walked over. The peephole was scratched, made everything blurry, but I could see a man standing there. He wore a dark blue work uniform with a name tag clipped to the chest pocket. His sleeves were rolled up, and he held a clipboard in one hand. He looked normal. Maybe late 40s. Short hair. Clean-shaven. He knocked again, a little louder this time. I cleared my throat. "Yeah. Evening, sir," he said. His voice was steady, polite. "I'm here for the scheduled inspection. Should only take a few minutes." I frowned. I hadn't scheduled anything. "What inspection?" I asked. "Routine check. Just making sure everything's up to code." I hesitated. My landlord never mentioned anything about inspections. I would have gotten an email. Maybe a notice under my door. But there was nothing. "Who sent you?" I asked. "The building manager," he said, like it was obvious. "This won't take long." I didn't like it. Something about the way he spoke, how he wasn't giving any real details. If this was real, wouldn't I have been told ahead of time? I kept my hand on the lock. "I wasn't told about this." He sighed like I was being difficult. "Not everyone gets the notice, but this is standard. Just need to check the pipes, smoke detectors, that sort of thing." He tapped the clipboard against his hand. The movement felt off. It was slow, deliberate. My stomach tightened. "Sorry," I said, but I can't let you in without proof. Silence. He didn't move, just stood there. Then he gave a small nod, like he was thinking something over. You can call the manager if you want, he said. They'll confirm it. His voice was different now. He wasn't being polite anymore. I didn't answer. I just stood there, watching him through the peephole. He waited. Then he shifted his weight and ran a hand over his jaw. Look, I've got a schedule to keep. If we don't do this today, we'll have to reschedule, and that's a whole thing. Just let me in real quick. The way he said that "just let me in real quick" made my skin crawl. It was too casual, too forced. I stepped back from the door, my breath coming faster. I thought about calling my landlord, but I didn't want him to hear me making the call. Then the doorknob moved. I jumped. He was trying to turn it, testing if it was locked. It was. Thank God, it was. I backed away, heart pounding. Then he knocked again. This time, it was softer. 3 slow taps. I didn't say anything. Then he spoke again, quieter this time. Come on, man. It was almost familiar. Like he knew me. I grabbed my phone and pulled up my landlord's number. The ringing felt like it went on forever. Pick up. Pick up. Behind the door, nothing. No more knocking. No footsteps. Just silence. Then my landlord answered. Hello? There's a guy here, I said quickly. Says he's here for an inspection. Did you send someone? A pause. Then. No, he said. We don't do surprise inspections. My fingers went numb. Are you home? My landlord asked. Yeah, I whispered. Lock your door. Don't open it. I'm calling security. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. I stood there, gripping my phone, waiting to hear something outside. Nothing. I waited another minute. Then, slowly, I moved back to the peephole. The hallway was empty. I didn't hear him leave. No footsteps. No door closing. Just gone. I stayed there, barely breathing. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then a noise. Not at the door. At my window. I live on the 3rd floor. There's no balcony, no fire escape. Just a straight drop to the ground. But I heard it. A soft, slow tapping against the glass. I didn't look. I couldn't. I just stepped back, gripping my phone so tight my knuckles ached. Then, silence again. I don't remember how long I stood there. Eventually, security showed up. They checked the hallway, the stairwell, even outside near the windows. Nothing. No sign of anyone. No cameras in the building, no way to know where he went. I didn't sleep that night. I still don't know what he wanted. But I know one thing. He wasn't a worker. I was on my way home from work, later than usual. It had been a long day, and I just wanted to get home, eat something, and sleep. Traffic wasn't bad, but I caught a red light at an intersection a few blocks from my apartment. I remember sighing, just staring at the red glow, zoning out. Then I noticed the car next to me. It was a dark sedan, maybe a few years old, Nothing unusual. The windows weren't tinted too dark, so I could see inside. At first, I wasn't really paying attention. Just another car, another driver waiting for the light. But then I saw movement in the back seat. A kid, maybe 10 years old. Short hair, pale face. At first, I thought they were just fidgeting, but then they turned and looked right at me. Their lips moved. 2 words. Help me. I felt something in my stomach drop. I blinked, not sure if I saw it right. The kid's mouth moved again. Help me. I straightened up, my hands gripping the wheel. Then the driver turned and looked at me. A man. Mid-40s, maybe older. Short hair, dark jacket. His face was blank. No reaction. He just stared, eyes locked onto mine. I felt my heart pick up. My first instinct was to grab my phone, but before I could, the light turned green. And the car took off. Not normal driving. Not pulling away casually. He sped through the intersection, cutting across lanes, disappearing down the road. I hesitated for half a second, then pressed the gas, trying to keep up. My mind was racing. Did I really just see that? Was the kid joking? Messing around? No, that wasn't a joke. The way they looked at me wide-eyed, desperate. The way they mouthed the words twice. Something was wrong. I sped up, keeping the sedan in sight. It weaved through traffic, faster than normal. Not crazy fast, not enough to draw attention, but enough to make it clear they didn't want to be followed. I was going to call 911. My hand hovered over my phone, but I didn't want to lose them. I kept one hand on the wheel, fumbling to open the dial pad. Then the sedan took a hard right onto a side street. I swerved, following. The road was darker here. Less streetlights, fewer cars. The sedan was ahead, moving fast. I dialed. My hands were slick on the wheel. The ringing felt like it went on forever. 911, what's your emergency? I kept my eyes on the sedan. There's a car, I said. My voice felt shaky. A black sedan. A kid in the back seat just mouthed, "Help me." The driver saw me watching and sped off. Where are you located? I gave the street name. The sedan was getting further. I pressed the gas. I'm following them, but... Do not follow, the operator said, cutting me off. Can you provide a license plate number? I squinted, but the car was too far now. The taillights glowed red, blurry in the dark. I can't see it. But it was a black sedan, older model. The driver was a white male, maybe mid-40s. Do you have a description of the child? Short hair, light skin. Looked around 10. The sedan turned again. A sharp left, fast. I slowed at the intersection, heart pounding. The road it turned onto was narrow, lined with warehouses and closed shops. No lights. No other cars. I stopped. The operator was still talking. Ma'am? Are you still there? I swallowed hard. They just turned onto a side street. I don't think I should. Do not follow, she repeated. We're dispatching officers to the area. Can you safely wait somewhere nearby? I looked down the dark street. The sedan was gone. No movement. No taillights. Just empty road disappearing into shadows. If I turned down there, I'd be alone. I gripped the wheel, forcing myself to breathe. Yeah, I said. I'll wait. The next few minutes felt stretched. I kept looking in my rear view, half expecting the sedan to come back, to pull up behind me, the driver stepping out. I shook the thought away. A few minutes later, a patrol car pulled up. I waved them down and told them everything. They asked the same questions. The plate number, the child's description, the exact direction they went. I answered as best as I could. One of the officers nodded, writing it down. The other one looked down the road where the sedan had vanished. "We'll check it out," he said. "You did the right thing not following." I nodded, gripping the straps of my bag to keep my hands from shaking. They told me they'd contact me if they needed anything else, then got back in their car and drove down the street, disappearing into the dark. I sat there for a long time before finally driving home. I kept checking the news for the next few days, searching for reports. A missing child, a police chase, anything. I never found anything. I don't know what happened. I don't know if the police found them. I don't know if I was the only one who saw. But I know what I saw, and I can't stop thinking about it. I was drunk, but not that drunk. I remember that clearly. The bar was crowded, my friends were loud, and I had that heavy feeling in my limbs that told me I was at my limit. I knew it was time to go. I called a rideshare like I always did, double-checked the app, saw the make and model of the car, even the driver's name. Black sedan. Driver named Mike. I stepped outside into the cold air, rubbing my arms. The street was busy with people heading home, cars pulling up and leaving just as fast. I stood on the curb, waiting. Then I saw it. A black sedan, same make and model as the app showed, rolling up slow. It stopped right in front of me. The windows were tinted, but I could see the driver's shape in the front seat. I pulled open the back door and got in. The inside smelled like air freshener, but under that, something else. Stale. Sweaty. The kind of smell that lingers in a car that's been driven too long without the windows down. I shut the door, settled in, and checked the app again. The little map was updating, showing we were moving. Right direction. I glanced at the driver in the rearview mirror. "Mike?" I asked. No answer. That was weird. Usually, they at least say yeah or something. But he just kept his hands on the wheel, eyes on the road. I cleared my throat. How's your night been?" "Nothing." I sat back, frowning. Maybe he didn't hear me? Maybe he just wasn't the chatty type? The car kept moving, smooth and steady. I looked outside. The streetlights blurred past. We were heading in the right direction, but something about the way he drove felt off. Like he was going just a little too fast, just a little too controlled. I checked the app again. The estimated time said 5 minutes. I exhaled, tried to shake the weird feeling. Maybe I was overthinking it. I looked at the back of his head, the way his hands gripped the wheel too tight. A minute passed. Then another. I glanced out the window again. We should have turned left a block ago. My stomach tightened. I leaned forward. "Hey, I think you..." The car sped up. Not a lot. Just enough that I felt it. I stared at the back of his head, my throat dry. "Hey," I said, louder this time. "You missed the turn." No response. I glanced at my phone again. The little car on the app was moving further from the route. I swallowed hard. Dude, you missed my turn. You need to. The car sped up again. My pulse slammed in my ears. I sat back, suddenly feeling too aware of how small the back seat was. How the doors had no handles on the inside. Hey, stop the car, I said, my voice shaking now. Nothing. I reached forward, tapping his shoulder. Hey! His hand shot up and grabbed my wrist. Tight. Too tight. His fingers dug into my skin. I sucked in a sharp breath, heart pounding. I tried to pull back, but he held firm. Kept his eyes on the road, his grip like a vice. Then, slowly, he turned his head just enough for me to see his face in the rearview mirror. And he smiled. I yanked my arm back as hard as I could. His grip held for a second, then slipped. I scrambled against the door, pressing back, my chest heaving. "Let me out," I said, breathless. "Let me out right now." He didn't answer. The car kept moving. I looked at my phone again. Hands shaking. The little car was nowhere near my home anymore. I fumbled for the emergency call button on the app, but before I could press it, he slammed on the brakes. I flew forward, hitting the back of the seat. My hand shot out, gripping the headrest to steady myself. Then the locks clicked open. I didn't wait. I grabbed the handle and threw myself out of the car. I hit the pavement hard, my hands scraping against the rough concrete. I gasped, my knees buckling as I scrambled to stand up. The car idled for a second. Then the tires screeched, and it sped off into the night. I stood there, panting, my whole body shaking. I looked around, realizing I had no idea where I was. The street was empty. No people. Just dark storefronts and flickering streetlights. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands, pressing 911. I told them everything. The car. The driver. The route. They asked if I got the plate number. I hadn't. In my panic, I never looked. By the time the cops got there, the car was long gone. They asked if I was hurt. I wasn't, just scraped up. They offered to take me home, and I didn't argue. I checked the app later. No ride was ever recorded. The request was still searching for a driver. Whoever picked me up wasn't my ride. I don't know if he was waiting. If he just saw a drunk guy standing alone and took a chance. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gotten out. But I still see that smile in the mirror. And I still feel his fingers around my wrist. I worked late that night. Later than usual. The office was almost empty when I left, just a couple of lights still on in the other department. I packed up my things, locked my computer, and grabbed my coat. Outside, the hallway was quiet. The cleaning crew had already come through. I walked down to the elevator, pressed the button, and waited. The air felt still, that weird silence you get when a building is mostly empty. The doors opened, and I stepped inside. The ride down was slow. The numbers above the door lit up one by one. When I reached the parking garage, the doors slid open with a soft chime. It was cold down there. Colder than it should have been. The kind of cold that settles in your bones. The air smelled like oil and concrete. The hum of the fluorescent lights filled the space, flickering in some places. I was parked near the far end, where the overhead lights weren't as bright. I started walking, my footsteps echoing. There weren't many cars left, just a handful scattered around. I reached into my bag, feeling for my keys. I always held them tight when I walked alone. I got to my car, pressed the button, and heard the click of the locks. I grabbed the handle. Then someone behind me said, "You left something." I froze. The voice was close. Too close. I turned fast, my heart pounding. No one was there. I looked around, my breath coming short. The garage stretched out, empty. No movement. Just cars and cold air. I swallowed hard, gripping my keys. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was the wind carrying a sound from somewhere else. I turned back to my car, but my hands were shaking now. I pulled open the door and threw my bag inside. Then I heard it again. "You left something." Clearer this time. A man's voice. Low. Steady. I spun around, my back against the car. My eyes darted across the garage, scanning the rows of vehicles, the concrete pillars. Still no one. But something felt wrong. Like I was being watched. I reached for my phone, fumbling with the screen, my fingers numb. I turned on the flashlight and swept it across the space. The beam cut through the dim light, bouncing off metal and concrete. Then movement. A shadow, shifting just behind a pillar a few rows over. I sucked in a breath, my chest tight. Someone was there. They were standing just out of sight, watching. Waiting. My pulse pounded in my ears. I stepped back, my foot hitting the edge of the door. I didn't know what to do. My car was right there. I could get in. Lock the doors. Drive away. But what if he was faster? I gripped my keys between my fingers like a weapon and forced myself to speak. "Who's there?" No answer. Just silence. Then a shoe scuffed against the concrete. The sound came from the other side of the car. He had moved. I yanked open the door and threw myself inside. I slammed it shut and hit the lock button so hard my finger hurt. My breathing was loud in the enclosed space, my hands gripping the wheel even though I hadn't started the engine yet. I couldn't see him, but he was there. I knew he was. I forced myself to move. I jammed the key into the ignition, twisting hard. The engine rumbled to life. Then a hand slapped against my window. I screamed. I barely got a glimpse of him, a dark jacket, a pale face, but I didn't wait. I shoved the car into reverse so fast the tires screeched. The hand slid away as I peeled back out of the space, my tires screeching against the concrete. I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. I just sped toward the exit, my chest tight, my breath coming in gasps. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the wheel. I hit the ramp and shot up into the night, my heart still hammering. I didn't stop driving. Not until I was miles away. I pulled over on a well-lit street and just sat there, hands gripping the wheel, my whole body shaking. I checked my phone. My hands were too unsteady to type at first, but I finally managed to call someone. I never saw his face clearly. Never found out who he was. But I know one thing. He wasn't there to give me something I left behind. I didn't notice him that night. Not once. It wasn't until the next morning, when I was looking through my phone that I saw him. It was a Friday, and a few of us had gone out to this bar near campus. It wasn't anything fancy, cheap drinks, loud music, packed with students. The kind of place where you had to shove past people just to get to the bathroom. I wasn't even going to go at first. I had a paper due that Monday, but my roommate, Tara, convinced me. Said I needed to get out, stop stressing so much. I figured a couple of drinks wouldn't hurt. We got there around 10, met up with some friends. I remember laughing a lot. Dancing. Taking stupid selfies. The usual. The night itself was a blur, but when I woke up the next morning, I had the dull headache that meant I drank just enough to feel it but not enough to regret it. Tara was still asleep, so I laid there for a while, scrolling through my phone. That's when I saw the pictures. The first one was just me and Tara, squished together in the crowd, holding our drinks. But in the background, slightly out of focus, there was a man. Standing still. His face was partially turned, so I couldn't tell if he was looking at us or past us. He was tall, with dark hair and a pale face. Nothing weird about him, just a random guy in the crowd. I kept scrolling. The next one was from later in the night. A group shot near the bar. And he was there again. Closer this time. Standing behind another group, but still in focus. Still looking. I frowned. My stomach felt a little off, but I told myself it was a coincidence. Just some guy who happened to be in the background. It was a packed bar, after all. I swiped again. Another picture. He was there. Different part of the bar. Still in the background. Still watching. I sat up. My fingers felt stiff as I scrolled faster. Another picture. Another. He was in all of them. Not just in the background of the same area, but in different spots. Like he had moved through the crowd, staying just far enough away to not be noticed, but always there. I felt sick. I woke Tara up, shoved my phone in her face. Look at this. She blinked at the screen, rubbing her eyes. Who's that? I don't know, I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. She scrolled through the pictures, slower than I had. Her eyebrows pulled together. That's weird. He was following us, I said. I knew it in my gut. Tara sat up straighter, suddenly awake. You think did he talk to us? I shook my head. I couldn't remember anyone like him. But then again, I hadn't been paying attention. We went through every picture, zooming in, looking for anything familiar. But nothing stood out except for him. And then Tara went still. What? I asked. She turned the phone toward me. This is from when we left. My breath caught. The picture was blurry, taken outside the bar. Just a stupid selfie we snapped before calling a ride. But in the far left corner, almost out of the frame, he was there. Standing by the exit. Facing us. Watching. My whole body went cold. We need to check the doorbell camera, Tara said suddenly. We had one. Our landlord installed them in all the apartments after someone got their bike stolen from the front porch. It wasn't fancy, but it saved recordings for a couple of days. I grabbed my laptop and pulled up the footage. Tara hovered behind me, silent. I clicked through the timeline, scanning for when we got home. There we were, stumbling up the steps, laughing. We unlocked the door, went inside. Nothing weird. Then I clicked forward a bit, just to see, and my stomach dropped. A few minutes after we went inside, he appeared, walking down the sidewalk, stopping in front of our apartment. He didn't come to the door, didn't try anything. He just stood there. Then, after about 30 seconds, he turned and walked away. I stared at the screen, barely breathing. Tara whispered, "What do we do?" I didn't know. We saved the pictures, downloaded the footage. We thought about going to the police, but what would we even say? Some guy was in the background of our pictures. He stood outside for 30 seconds and then left. They wouldn't take us seriously. We double-checked the locks, closed all the blinds. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside made my skin crawl. But nothing else happened. Whoever he was, he never came back. I woke up because I was cold. I remember that part clearly. The kind of cold that makes your skin feel tight. My blanket had slid halfway off the bed, but that wasn't what made me sit up. It was the air. It felt different, sharper. My apartment has terrible insulation, but my bedroom stays warm when the door is shut. That night, though, the air felt like it was coming from outside. I turned over to grab my blanket, and that's when I saw it. My window was open. Not just cracked. Wide open. I froze. I always kept it shut. I never even opened it during the summer because my building didn't have screens, and I didn't want bugs getting in. It was locked when I went to sleep. My heart started beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. I sat there, staring at the dark shape of the window against the night sky. My apartment was on the second floor. There was no fire escape, no ledge, nothing to climb. I tried to tell myself I had forgotten to lock it, that maybe the wind had pushed it open. But there was no wind. The trees outside weren't moving. The air was still. I reached over and turned on my bedside lamp. And that's when I noticed the floor. There was dirt. Just a little, near the window frame. A few smudges, like someone had stepped inside and then wiped their shoes before going further. I didn't move. I just sat there, trying to listen, trying to hear something over the sound of my own breathing. My bedroom door was open. I never slept with it open. I felt sick. If someone had come in, they could be anywhere in the apartment. The air felt too thick. My hands were sweaty, but I was still so cold. I reached for my phone, trying to be quiet. My fingers fumbled with the screen. I kept telling myself to call the police, but I couldn't make myself press the button. What if they were still here? What if they heard me? I turned off the lamp. My own heartbeat was too loud. I stayed like that for I don't know how long. Minutes, maybe longer. Then, somewhere in the apartment, the floor creaked. I stopped breathing. It was soft, but it was real. Not the pipes. Not the building settling. Someone was in my apartment. I couldn't stay in that bed. I had to move. I slid out as slowly as I could, keeping my feet off the floor. My window was still open. I thought about climbing out, but the drop was too high. I had to go through the apartment. I moved toward the door, trying to listen for anything else. My whole body felt slow, like my limbs weren't connected right. The hallway was dark. I stepped out and kept close to the wall. I didn't have any weapons, nothing heavy, nothing sharp. I listened. Nothing. The living room was just past the kitchen. The front door was beyond that. The floor felt like it would creak under me any second. I took one step, then another. Then I saw it. The front door was unlocked. I knew I had locked it before bed. I moved faster. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I reached for the lock, turned it as fast as I could, pulled the door open. The hallway outside was empty. I stepped out and shut the door behind me. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn the lock. I didn't go back inside. I went straight downstairs, straight out onto the street. I didn't stop walking until I was 2 blocks away. I called a friend, told him something was wrong. He picked me up, and I stayed at his place that night. The next day, we went back. Nothing was missing. Not my wallet, not my laptop, nothing. But there was more dirt near the window. And the floor near the kitchen looked different, like someone had been standing there for a long time. I never found out who it was. I moved out 2 weeks later. The baby monitor was quiet except for the soft sound of the fan in the nursery. I was sitting on the couch in the living room, scrolling through my phone, half watching some reality show on low volume. It was almost 11. The parents were supposed to be home by midnight. The house was big but old. The kind where every step on the hardwood creaked, even when you tried to be careful. The nursery was upstairs at the end of the hall, across from the parents' bedroom. I had checked on the baby twice already. She was sleeping fine. Then I heard it. A creaking sound from upstairs. I looked at the baby monitor. Nothing. The little green light blinked steady. I turned the TV volume down all the way. Listened. Another creak. Slow, deliberate. Not the baby. The old house made noises, sure. I had heard it settle a few times earlier, pipes shifting, wind against the windows. This was different. I sat there, waiting to hear it again. Nothing. Maybe the parents had come home early, though I hadn't heard a car. I stood up. The living room light cast a glow up the staircase, but everything past the top step was dark. I took my phone with me, holding it tight. The stairs creaked under my weight, but I kept my steps light. I didn't want to wake the baby if it was nothing. At the top, the hallway was still. The nursery door was cracked open like I had left it. I took a few more steps. Another creak. I stopped. It had come from the parents' bedroom. The door was open, but only a little. Just a few inches. I was sure it had been closed before. I swallowed, listening hard. My fingers felt tight around my phone. I took a step closer, reached out, and nudged the door open. The room was dark, but enough light came in from the hallway to see. The closet door was open. Not all the way. Just slightly. I had been in here earlier to grab a spare blanket for the baby. The closet had been shut. My breathing felt loud. I took another step forward. The floor groaned under me. Then I saw it. At the bottom of the closet, just barely visible past the crack in the door, was a pair of shoes. Black. Worn. Not facing in. Facing out. Like someone was standing there. Watching. I didn't move. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was in there. I took a slow step back, trying not to make a sound. I needed to get the baby. I turned, moving fast but quiet. My hands felt cold. The nursery door was still open. I slipped inside, went straight to the crib. She was still asleep, her little chest rising and falling under the nightlight's glow. I reached down, careful not to wake her, and lifted her up. She stirred but didn't cry. Then, from down the hall, a soft sound. A breath. I didn't stop. I held her close and moved to the bedroom door. Peered out. The hallway was still empty. The closet door was open wider now. I moved fast. Out of the room, down the stairs. My legs felt shaky, but I didn't stop. I grabbed the keys from the counter, unlocked the front door, and stepped outside into the cold night air. I got in the car, locked the doors, and kept the baby against my chest. I called the police. They came fast. Checked the house. They found the closet door open, just like I had seen it. But no one was inside. No windows were open. No doors were unlocked. But in the bedroom closet, on the floor where the shoes had been, a footprint. The parents came home while the police were still there. They were shaken but grateful. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was out of place. Except for the closet door. I never babysat for them again. I was in bed when my phone buzzed. It was almost 2 a.m. I wasn't asleep yet, just lying there in the dark, scrolling. I had work in the morning but couldn't shut my brain off. The notification was from my doorbell camera app. Motion detected at front door. I hesitated before tapping it. Probably a cat or a moth flying too close to the lens. Maybe some kid messing around. It had happened before. The feed loaded. A man was standing inches from the camera. Not moving. Not knocking. Just staring. His face filled the screen. His eyes looked directly into the lens. He wasn't wearing a mask, no hood, nothing to hide his face. He was just there. Close enough that I could see the shine on his skin from the porch light. I sat up in bed. He didn't move. Didn't blink. The timestamp showed he had been standing there for almost a full minute before the motion alert triggered. I turned up the volume. No sound. No footsteps. Just him standing too close, breathing. I reached for the bedside lamp but stopped myself. I didn't want him to know I was awake. I checked the locks on my phone. Deadbolt was on. Chain was on. Back door was locked. The windows were shut. The camera had a microphone. I could have said something. Asked what he wanted. I didn't. I just watched him. His expression never changed. He wasn't smiling. Wasn't angry. Just blank. Then he leaned in closer. His nose almost touched the camera. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, like that would do anything. My heart was pounding. Then, finally, he moved. Not away. He reached up, slowly, and ran his fingers over the camera. Lightly. Like he was testing it. Then he stepped back. Just enough for me to see more of him. Dark jacket. Dirty jeans. His hands hung at his sides. Then he did something that made my stomach drop. He reached into his pocket and pulled something out. keys. Not his. Mine. My spare house key. The one I kept in the little magnetic box under the porch railing. I had put it there months ago in case I locked myself out. I had never used it. I had never even told anyone it was there. He held it up, tilting his head like he wanted to make sure I saw it. Then he turned. Not toward the street. Toward the side of the house. Where the back door was. I jumped out of bed so fast I nearly tripped. I ran to the bedroom door, locked it, then grabbed my phone and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. The dispatcher answered. I whispered that someone was outside, that he had my key, that he was trying to get in. She told me to stay on the line. Asked if I had a weapon. I didn't. I grabbed the heaviest thing near me, a lamp, and stood by the door, listening. The camera app was still open. I switched to the backyard feed. He was there. Standing at the back door, testing the handle. My stomach turned to ice. He had the key. He could get in. I gripped the lamp tighter, heart slamming against my ribs. Then, a siren. Not far. Getting closer. The man froze. For the first time, his expression changed. Not fear. Not panic. Just disappointment. Then he turned and walked away. Not running. Just walking. The police showed up fast. 2 cars. They searched the yard, the street. He was gone. They found the key on the back steps. He had dropped it. The officer asked if I had seen his face clearly. I had. They said they would patrol the area. Said to call if I saw anything else. They left. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I took the key box from under the porch and threw it in the trash. I moved a chair in front of the bedroom door before trying to rest. And even after that, I kept waking up, thinking I heard something. Because the worst part wasn't that he had found my key. The worst part was that he knew I was watching him. And he didn't care. I remember that morning like it was yesterday. It started out like any other. I had woken up early, well before sunrise, and decided to go for a jog. The weather was cool, a little crisp, which was perfect for the trail I like to run. I had been running this same wooded path for years, but that day felt different from the start. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, even though nothing was out of place at first. The trail was tucked deep into the woods, far from any major roads. There were no houses around, just trees and dirt paths. It was peaceful, quiet, the kind of place I would go to clear my head. I had the place to myself, or so I thought. I started off at a slow pace, enjoying the silence, the sound of my shoes crunching on the gravel. But after about 10 minutes in, I started to notice something odd. I thought I heard footsteps behind me. It wasn't much at first, just a faint shuffle, barely noticeable over the sound of my own breath. I glanced over my shoulder. There was nobody there. The path was empty. I shook it off, assuming it was just the wind or an animal in the woods. I've heard wildlife before, especially early in the morning. But then it happened again. This time, I definitely heard the sound of footsteps, slower, almost in sync with mine. I turned around once more carefully this time. Still nothing. No one. I wasn't paranoid, not really. But something about it felt off. The air felt heavier, the woods too still. I thought maybe someone else had decided to use the same trail that day, but I couldn't see anyone. I started to pick up my pace, not because I was scared, but because I wanted to get ahead of whoever might be behind me. But then, I heard it again. The same footsteps. Closer this time. I sped up, trying to ignore the feeling creeping over me. I didn't want to be followed. I was alone out there, with no one around for miles. But the faster I ran, the faster the footsteps behind me seemed to follow. It was like the person, whoever it was matching my pace. At that point, I started running full speed. My heart was beating harder, and I was starting to panic. I wanted to turn around, but I was afraid if I did, I would see someone right behind me. So I just kept going, not daring to look back. I rounded a bend in the trail and then stopped. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe I thought that if I just paused for a second, the person following me would keep going. Or maybe I just needed to catch my breath. But when I stopped, everything went silent. The footsteps stopped too. I stood there, breathing heavily, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced over my shoulder again. There was no one there. I thought I was imagining things, that maybe I had let my mind play tricks on me. But then, as I looked down at the dirt trail, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Fresh footprints. They weren't mine. They were too close together, too light to be from a heavy runner like me. And they were in the exact spot where I had stopped running, only a few feet behind me. My stomach dropped. I took a step back, trying to process what I was seeing. There were no other tracks in front of me, no sign of anyone having passed through before. But these prints, they were clear. Fresh. They had to have been made only seconds before. I quickly turned around again and looked down the trail in both directions. Nothing. No one. It was as if the person had vanished into thin air. I backed away slowly, then turned and started running again, faster this time. I didn't care what direction I was headed anymore. I just needed to get out of there, away from whatever or whoever had been following me. I didn't stop to look back again. I just kept running, my breath ragged, my legs burning. When I finally reached the end of the trail, where the parking lot was, I stopped and looked around. There was no one in sight. I was alone. But I didn't feel safe anymore. I got into my car, locked the doors, and just sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm myself down. I thought about going back, maybe checking the trail where I had seen the footprints, but the idea made my skin crawl. I ended up driving straight home. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there with me, someone watching, someone following. The whole time I was running, I kept thinking I was being paranoid. But now, after seeing those footprints, I couldn't ignore what had happened. I haven't gone back to that trail since. I don't know if it was just a coincidence, or if someone was actually out there, following me. Either way, I don't want to find out. It happened a few months ago, but I still think about it almost every time I drive at night. I can't seem to shake the feeling, even now. I had just finished a long shift at work and was on my way home when I realized I was running low on gas. I wasn't too far from a gas station that I usually stopped at, so I decided to pull in. It was already late, around midnight, and the place was practically empty, just like I expected. I remember it being unusually quiet for a gas station. The faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound, aside from the quiet hum of the pumps. I was the only car there. I filled up the tank quickly, then made my way inside to pay. The cashier was standing behind the counter, looking a little tired, but that wasn't unusual at that hour. He gave me a quick nod when I walked in. I didn't think much of it. I was just tired and looking forward to getting home. I approached the counter and handed him my card. As he was processing the payment, he casually asked, "Are you alone?" I remember thinking it was a weird question. Not in a bad way, but just odd, you know? It wasn't like he was asking out of concern or anything. It was like he was just making small talk. So, without thinking too much about it, I said, "Yeah, I'm alone." The moment the words left my mouth, his face changed. It was subtle at first, but it was definitely there. His expression, which had been neutral before, turned into something more serious. It was almost like a flicker of concern, or maybe something else, something I couldn't quite place. I remember the way his eyes seemed to narrow, and he glanced quickly over his shoulder, like he was checking something behind him. Then, he looked back at me and said, in a quieter voice, "Then don't go back outside yet." I froze. I couldn't help it. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, staring at him, trying to figure out if I had heard him right. He didn't smile, didn't make any jokes, and didn't seem like he was playing around. It was all too serious. "Excuse me?" I finally managed to ask. I don't know why, but I had this sudden wave of unease. It was like the air in the room had changed, like everything had gotten heavier. He looked at me again, and for a second, I thought maybe he was going to tell me something, but he didn't. Instead, he just gave a small shake of his head, like he was trying to decide whether or not he should say anything more. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at him. He didn't move, and I could feel my heart start to race. I couldn't tell if he was warning me or if something else was going on. The silence between us was thick. Finally, I just grabbed my receipt, shoved it into my bag, and took a step back from the counter. I remember my hand trembling a little as I took my card back. I didn't say anything else. I just nodded at him, not sure if I should say anything or if I should leave. The whole situation felt off, like I was missing something obvious. I didn't want to ask him what he meant, though. I didn't want to make the situation worse. I turned toward the door, still unsure of what was going on, but when I looked back at him, he was still watching me. His eyes were fixed on me now, like he was waiting for me to leave, but also like he was expecting something. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the feeling was unmistakable. I stepped outside, still trying to shake off the unease in my stomach. The air outside felt colder than it should have been for that time of year, and the lights in the parking lot flickered slightly. My car was parked right by the door, so I didn't have to walk far. I took a quick glance around, half expecting to see something or someone, but there was nothing unusual. No one else was around. Just the quiet hum of the gas station and the faint sounds of traffic from the nearby road. I was about to get into my car when I noticed something. There was a man standing near the far side of the lot, just past the row of trees. He was standing still, facing my car, but his body was slightly angled, like he was trying to stay hidden in the shadows. I couldn't see his face, but I could tell he was looking directly at me. I don't know how long he had been standing there, but the moment I saw him, I felt my whole body go cold. That same feeling of dread from inside the store washed over me again. The man didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, staring. I didn't waste another second. I threw open my car door, jumped inside, and locked the door without looking away from the man. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, and I swore I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I glanced at the gas station one last time before I pulled out of the lot. The cashier was standing by the window, still watching me. I couldn't be sure, but I swore there was a hint of something in his expression. A look that said he knew exactly what was going on outside, even if I didn't. I drove home faster than I usually would, and I didn't stop again until I got there. I don't know why I felt so compelled to leave so quickly, but I did. Every time I think about it, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I had stayed just a little longer, or if I had asked the cashier what he meant by his warning. I haven't gone back to that gas station since. I don't know if the man I saw outside was connected to what the cashier said, but I don't want to find out. I still think about it now and then, but the one thing I'm sure of is that I'm never stopping at that place late at night again. We had just moved into our first house, a small, old thing on the edge of town. It was the perfect fixer-upper, or at least, that's what we thought. We spent months saving up for it, finding the right one, and we were finally here. The house had character, creaky floors, old wooden beams, a small attic that I had always been curious about, but it was the kind of house you could see potential in. The first few days were mostly unpacking and figuring out where to put everything. It was a bit of a mess, but it felt good. We both were excited. Things were going well until about a week in, when the sound started. At first, I thought I was imagining things. It was late at night, around 2 a.m., and we were both in bed. I was just about to drift off when I heard it. It was soft, like something brushing against the floor above us. A shuffle. Just the faintest sound, but it was enough to pull me out of my half-sleep. I laid there for a second, listening, trying to figure out what it could be. At first, I thought maybe it was just the owls settling, the kind of noises older homes make when the temperature drops. But then I heard it again. This time, it was a little louder. Like someone was moving around up there. I didn't want to wake my husband over something that seemed so small, so I just brushed it off. It was probably a raccoon or a squirrel, something small. We lived near some trees, and I figured the animals had probably found a way into the attic. The next night, though, the sound came again. And this time, it was a bit more distinct. Shuffling. It sounded like something or someone was walking around up there. I could hear it moving slowly, dragging something. My heart skipped a beat. Now, I wasn't so sure. Why would there be someone moving around in the attic? We hadn't even unpacked everything, let alone checked the attic. I turned over in bed to face my husband. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He groaned and stretched, half awake. What?" The shuffling noise. "It's coming from the attic." He didn't seem too worried. "It's probably just an animal," he muttered before rolling over and going back to sleep. I stayed up for a while, just listening. The noise came and went, each time just as unsettling. My mind raced. I told myself it was just some critter up there. The house was old. It had to be. But deep down, I had this creeping feeling that something wasn't right. I was starting to get scared, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. So, I tried to ignore it and went back to sleep. The next day, I brought it up again to my husband. He didn't seem to be taking it seriously, but he agreed to check out the attic when we had time. So, that weekend, we made our way up there. The attic was dusty and smelled musty, like no one had been up there in years. There were old boxes scattered around, and bits of old furniture covered with sheets. It wasn't much to look at, honestly, but it was exactly what you'd expect from an unused attic. I climbed up the ladder first, poking my head around, looking for anything out of place. The only thing I saw was the usual old junk. But then, just as I was about to turn around and go back down, I noticed something in the far corner, something partially covered by a sheet. "Hey," I called to my husband, who was standing at the bottom of the ladder. "Come look at this." He climbed up after me and came over to where I was standing. There, in the corner, was an old mattress. It was crumpled and worn, like it had been up there for a long time. And around it, food wrappers. Lots of them. Old bags of chips, candy wrappers, fast food containers. Everything was just scattered around the mattress. It looked like someone had been living up there. It wasn't just a random collection of trash, it seemed deliberate. I felt my stomach twist. My breath caught in my throat as I stood there staring at the mess. "What the hell is this?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My husband looked at me, his face going pale. "What the hell?" We both stood there for a second, processing what we were seeing. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces started to come together. The noises at night. The shuffling. It wasn't an animal. It had been a person, or someone had been up there. How long had they been living in our attic? I felt a cold wave of panic wash over me. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. "This isn't just trash, is it?" I asked. My husband's voice was tense. "No, it's not." We didn't touch anything at first. It felt wrong, like if we disturbed the mess, we would be crossing a line we weren't ready to cross. But after a few moments, we knew we had to do something. We had to call someone. So, we left the attic and went straight to the phone. We called the police. It wasn't something I wanted to do, but it was too much. I was too scared to just handle it myself. The police were understanding, though. They told us to stay in the house, and they sent someone out immediately to check things out. When the officer arrived, we led him up to the attic. He didn't say much at first, just examined the mattress and the mess. After a while, he turned to us, his face serious. "Someone has been living up here for a while," he said. "It's clear from the wrappers and the mattress." He asked if we knew of anyone who might have had access to the house before we moved in. My husband and I both shook our heads. We'd done a walkthrough before buying the house, and everything seemed fine. The officer said that it could have been someone who had been squatting there for a while. But that wasn't the part that freaked me out. What really got to me was when he said, "This might be recent, but it's hard to say how long they've been up here. We'll need to investigate further." They took everything down. They searched the attic, and they found some other strange things, scratches on the floor, things moved around that shouldn't have been. But there was no sign of the person who had been there. No trace. It was like they vanished. We never found out who it was. The police didn't find any evidence of forced entry, and no one had seen anything suspicious. I tried to put it out of my mind, but every time I hear the house creak at night, I think about those shuffling noises. We never really felt safe in that house again. After a few weeks, we decided to move out. It was just too much. We sold the house and found a new place. I haven't thought about it as much lately, but when I do, I can't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever was up there is still out there, waiting. I've always been the type of person who doesn't get scared easily. I live alone in a small house, and I've always felt comfortable here. It's a quiet neighborhood, pretty calm for the most part. The house isn't anything fancy, just a small 2-bedroom with a yard, but it's mine. And, up until this night, I always felt safe. It started around 2 a.m. I had been in bed for a few hours already, drifting in and out of sleep. I remember waking up because I heard a sound, a soft knock on my door. It was quiet, but enough to stir me from my sleep. At first, I thought it was just a car backfiring outside or maybe the house settling, but then it came again, a single knock. I looked at the clock. 2:01 a.m. I immediately felt a cold twinge of unease in my stomach. Who could be knocking at this hour? I live in a small town, and there are hardly ever people out this late, let alone strangers at my door. I thought maybe it was a neighbor, but it seemed odd. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I didn't want to be paranoid. I got out of bed and walked to the door, moving slowly as I tried to figure out what was going on. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. I approached the door, not sure if I was relieved or more nervous. I crouched down to look through the peephole, thinking that I'd see someone on the other side, maybe just a late-night visitor or a friend who needed help. But when I peered through, I saw nothing. No one was standing there. I hesitated for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. Maybe they'd stepped back, or maybe they were just out of view. But I stood there, staring through the hole for a good minute, and still nothing. The area was completely empty, the porch light casting shadows on the ground, and the street was quiet, like it usually is at this time of night. I let out a deep breath, trying to brush it off. I was probably just imagining things. I turned around to walk back to my room, but before I could even take 2 steps, it came again. Knock. Knock. It was louder this time. The knock sounded right on the door, like someone was standing on the other side, waiting. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. I didn't know what to do. The first knock had been odd, but I could chalk it up to a mistake or some weird coincidence. But this second one felt different. Like someone was deliberately trying to get my attention. And it was so late. Who would be knocking at my door at 2 a.m.? I took a step back, away from the door. My mind raced. Should I open it? Should I call the police? I wasn't sure what to think. I don't know what I was expecting, but I didn't want to make a mistake either. I tried to calm myself down, rationalize. It was probably just a prank, right? Or maybe someone had knocked and walked away, and I just didn't see them. But the way the knock sounded, so deliberate and close, didn't sit right with me. And the fact that they knocked again, even though I hadn't opened the door. I don't know, it just felt off. I looked back at the peephole. I had to check again. There had to be someone there. I approached the door cautiously, taking slow, careful steps, and crouched down to the peephole once more. Nothing. The porch was empty. I could feel the tension in my chest tightening. I felt like something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I backed away from the door and stood in the hallway for a second, trying to figure out if I should call someone or just ignore it. But then, it happened again. Knock. 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 This time, it was faster. More insistent. And it sounded like it was coming from the exact same spot as before. Not off to the side, not down the hallway. Right at the door. I couldn't bring myself to open it this time. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my legs felt weak. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew I wasn't prepared for whatever was on the other side. I was paralyzed for a moment. I stood there, just listening to the silence that followed. The knock was sharp, and it echoed in the otherwise quiet house. I grabbed my phone and texted my best friend. I don't know why I didn't call her directly. Maybe because I didn't want to sound ridiculous, but I needed someone to know what was happening. I quickly typed out a message. Someone's knocking at my door. It's really late. I'm scared. I hit send and waited. I didn't move from the hallway. I stayed frozen, waiting for any sound. I wanted to look through the peephole again, but I was too scared. What if they saw me? What if they knew I was watching? The seconds felt like hours. Every little creak of the house made me jump, and every time I looked at the door, I felt my heart race faster. But the knock didn't come again. I don't know how much time passed, but it felt like forever. Then, my phone buzzed. It was a reply from my friend. Call the police. Don't open the door. Her message made my blood run cold. She was right. I shouldn't open it. Something was off. I had to call the police. I dialed 911, my hands shaking as I waited for the operator to pick up. I could hear the phone ringing in the quiet house, my heart thudding in my ears. When the operator answered, I explained as quickly as I could that someone had been knocking on my door, and I didn't know who they were. I told them I hadn't opened the door and that I felt unsafe. The dispatcher stayed calm and assured me that help was on the way. They told me to stay inside, lock all the doors, and not to open the door under any circumstances. I don't remember much of what they said after that. I was just focused on the silence that had fallen again. I stayed in the hallway, staring at the door. I didn't dare approach it again. I don't know how long I waited. It felt like forever, but finally, I heard sirens in the distance. When the police arrived, they searched the house and checked the perimeter. They didn't find anyone, but they assured me they'd keep an eye on the area for the rest of the night. The knocking didn't happen again. I don't know who it was or why they came, but after that, I didn't sleep much that night. Or the night after. I'm still not sure if it was a prank or something worse. Either way, I learned to always trust my gut. I've had the police check my door and windows a couple of times since then. I still lock everything, even during the day. I don't know what would have happened if I had opened that door. And I don't really want to find out. I don't know why I didn't think to call the police right away. I guess I was trying to convince myself it was just some weird misunderstanding. Maybe someone had ordered it by mistake, or maybe a friend was playing a prank on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right the moment I saw the package. It was a Saturday morning, just after 10 a.m. I had just finished my coffee and was scrolling through my phone when I heard the doorbell ring. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I don't have a lot of visitors, so I wasn't sure who it could be. I went to the door, opened it, and saw a small, unmarked package sitting on the welcome mat. I didn't recognize the handwriting on the package. It wasn't anything special, just a plain brown box. No return address, no labels, nothing. I bent down, picked it up, and turned it over in my hands. It wasn't heavy, just light enough to make me curious but not enough to be alarming. I had no idea what it was. I figured it was probably something from an online order I'd forgotten about, or maybe some kind of mistake. But as soon as I opened it, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The first thing I noticed was a small velvet pouch inside. I didn't remember ordering anything that would come in a pouch, and I didn't recognize it at all. I pulled it out, and when I opened it, I found a necklace. A silver chain with a small, intricate pendant. It was beautiful, but also unsettling in a way I couldn't explain. It looked expensive, not something I'd just buy on a whim. I had no idea where it had come from. But then I saw the note tucked inside the pouch. The note was simple. It read, "I saw you looking at this in the store. It suits you." My heart skipped. I stared at the words for a few seconds, not really processing what they meant. It was written in plain black ink, no flair, no special writing, just simple. But what caught me off guard was that I had been looking at something like this at a jewelry store a few days ago. I remember standing in front of the display case, looking at necklaces. I don't usually buy jewelry for myself, but something about that one caught my eye. I hadn't even touched it, though. I hadn't picked it up. I hadn't even gone inside the store. I just walked by the window and glanced at it for a few seconds, that was all. I could feel my pulse quicken, and I suddenly felt very exposed. Someone had been watching me, had seen me standing outside that store, and had somehow known that I looked at that necklace. But how? I didn't recognize the handwriting. I didn't recognize the necklace. And there was no way to know who would have seen me. I stood there in my doorway, the package still in my hands, unsure of what to do. The air around me felt colder. The package was warm, but the more I stared at the necklace, the colder I felt. It wasn't just the fact that someone knew where I had been. It was the realization that someone was out there, watching me, paying attention to what I did. I was about to close the door when I noticed something else. At the very bottom of the package, underneath the velvet pouch, was a small slip of paper. I pulled it out and unfolded it slowly, my hands trembling now. It said, "I'm glad you like it. I'll be seeing you soon." That was it. No name, no contact information, just those few words. I felt my stomach drop. The words were so casual, so assured. It didn't feel like a prank anymore. It felt like someone knew me. Someone who had been watching me. Someone who had been following me. I immediately looked out the window, scanning the street. My car was parked outside, but there was no one around. No one was walking on the sidewalk, and nothing seemed out of place. But the words echoed in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing right there, watching me receive that package. I rushed inside, locked the door, and sat down at the kitchen table. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to tell. Should I call the police? I didn't know if it was even worth it. It didn't feel like a crime had been committed, just an unsettling experience. But the note, it was a threat, wasn't it? Whoever had sent it clearly knew something I didn't. I spent the rest of the day obsessing over it. I couldn't focus on anything. I kept checking the locks on my doors, kept looking out the window to see if anyone was walking by. I kept thinking about the note, about the words, about the way I felt when I read them. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was like I wasn't alone anymore, like someone had a window into my life that I didn't know about. That night, I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. I kept hearing noises outside, distant sounds of cars or footsteps, but every time I checked, there was nothing. I kept imagining someone standing at the edge of the street, waiting for me to make a move. The anxiety got worse the longer I stayed in the house. I locked every window, double-checked the door, and even turned on the security system. It wasn't until the next morning that I finally made the decision to call the police. I explained everything about the package, the note, and the necklace. The officer I spoke to was professional, but I could tell he didn't think it was serious enough to act on. He told me to report any further incidents and to be cautious, but that was it. He didn't seem concerned. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but their indifference made me feel even worse. I knew this wasn't over. I didn't know who was watching me or why they were doing this, but I couldn't help feeling like this was just the beginning. It was as if I had been marked, like the package had been the first step in something bigger. For the next few weeks, nothing else happened. I stayed inside more than usual, made sure to avoid the street where I had been seen, and watched for any strange behavior. I still couldn't stop thinking about that necklace, though. I didn't wear it. I never did. It sat in my drawer, untouched, like a reminder that I wasn't safe, that someone out there knew where I went, what I did, and who I was. Then, one evening, about a month later, I received another package. This time, it wasn't a necklace. It was a small box with a simple note inside. I missed you. That was the moment I knew for sure. The person watching me wasn't going away. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was going to happen, and I wasn't ready for it. It was about 3 in the morning when I saw him. I had been driving for hours, the long stretch of highway ahead of me empty and desolate, just the hum of the engine and the occasional flicker of headlights from passing cars. The road had been straight for miles, and I could feel my eyelids getting heavy, the kind of tiredness that you can only get from driving long distances at night. I had left my friend's place in the city and was on my way back home, a good few hours ahead of me. The weather was clear, no rain or fog, but the night was still. Too still, actually. I hadn't passed another car for a while, and the silence was starting to feel a bit eerie. I thought about pulling over to get some coffee at a gas station up ahead, but I didn't want to waste time. I was tired, but I was close. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I saw that it was a person, standing on the side of the highway with a thumb out. It was strange to see anyone out there, especially at this hour. No one should be on this stretch of road at this time. There wasn't even a town for miles. But I had always been the kind of person who couldn't just leave someone stranded, no matter how late or how far out of the way they were. I slowed down as I approached, and the figure stepped closer to the road, his thumb still out. I stopped beside him, rolled the passenger side window down, and called out. "Need a ride?" The guy nodded slowly, his movements stiff, almost too stiff, like he wasn't sure if he wanted to get in or not. He was tall, probably in his mid-30s, with scruffy brown hair and a worn-out jacket that didn't look like it'd keep anyone warm on a cold night like this. He didn't say anything, just nodded again, then opened the door and climbed in. I made a quick glance at him as he settled into the seat. His face was pale, his eyes wide but not in a way that seemed nervous. He just stared ahead. There was something off about him, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was just how tired I was, or maybe it was the isolation of the road messing with my head. Still, I tried to make conversation. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the silence. I always try to be friendly with hitchhikers. You never know who they are, but a little kindness goes a long way, right? He didn't answer. I glanced at him again, but he was still staring straight ahead, his hands folded in his lap. The silence wasn't uncomfortable at first, but after a while, it started to feel heavier, like there was something pressing down on me. His lack of response wasn't weirding me out yet, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. I kept my eyes on the road, my knuckles gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. I cleared my throat, trying again. "You been out here long?" Nothing. It was like he hadn't even heard me. I glanced at him again. His face was still turned forward, but there was something odd about the way his head was tilted. It was almost like he was craning his neck to keep his eyes locked on the road. I couldn't tell if he was just awkward or if there was something else going on. Maybe he was just tired too. I drove on for a while in silence, just the low hum of the tires on the road, and the occasional flicker of light from my headlights catching the occasional tree or sign. The feeling in the car kept getting worse though. The longer I drove, the more I started to feel like something wasn't right. I couldn't see his face now, but the air around me seemed heavier, like I was being watched in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. I couldn't take it anymore. I glanced over at him, trying to get a read on his face. And that's when I saw it. He was staring right at me. His eyes were wide open, and his mouth, oh God, his mouth was spread into the whitest, most unnatural grin I've ever seen. His teeth were too white, too sharp. It wasn't a smile. It was something else entirely. A smile would have been normal. This was wrong. I swerved a little on the road, but I quickly corrected myself. I tried to act like nothing happened, like maybe I just misread it. But I couldn't get my eyes off him. His grin was still there, stretching wider now. It didn't make any sense. How could someone look so calm and so wrong at the same time? I took a deep breath and turned my attention back to the road, trying to focus. But now, every passing second felt like an eternity. I wanted to say something. Ask him why he was acting like this, ask him what was going on, but every time I thought about it, the words wouldn't come. I kept looking at him from the corner of my eye, watching as his expression stayed frozen, that unnatural grin never leaving his face. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, growing louder, my chest tightening. I wanted to pull over, tell him to get out, get away from me. But the road was dark. No lights, no cars, just a lonely stretch ahead. What if something happened if I stopped? What if he wasn't the only one out there? And then, the thing that made it worse, he still didn't speak. Not a single word. He just kept staring at me, smiling like he knew something I didn't. He didn't even blink. His eyes were locked on me the whole time, no break, no relief. I could feel the tension in the air, the pressure building, and my grip on the steering wheel was white-knuckled. I was seconds away from telling him to get out, to stop the car and get away from me, when the road ahead finally opened up into a small gas station. I pulled in so quickly that the tires squealed. Without thinking, I threw the car into park and immediately jumped out, my legs shaky. I didn't even care that I left the door open, just that I needed to get away. I turned and looked back at the car. He was still sitting there. His head tilted forward slightly, that same grin still plastered across his face. His eyes never left mine. I slammed the door behind me and ran into the gas station without looking back. The attendant gave me a weird look when I rushed in, but I didn't care. I stood there, trying to catch my breath, telling myself that maybe I had just been paranoid. I went to the counter to pay for some coffee, trying to act normal, but my mind was racing. When I looked out the window, the car was gone. No sign of a man, no car, nothing. The road was empty again, just like before. But the feeling, the weight in my chest, it didn't go away. I haven't picked up a hitchhiker since that night. I still don't know who he was, or why he looked at me like that. And every time I drive down that stretch of highway, I can't help but look over my shoulder. I didn't think it would be a big deal. Moving into a shared apartment to save money seemed like the most practical option. I'd been living in a cramped studio for a while, struggling to make rent on my own, and the idea of splitting costs with someone else felt like a relief. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I got on my feet, figured things out. I found the listing online, and the place seemed perfect. Affordable, in a nice neighborhood, close to work. The only catch was that my new roommate, Sarah, was someone I didn't know. But that wasn't a huge red flag. I'd seen worse situations, people meeting roommates through random ads. So, I decided to take a leap. We met for coffee before the move-in date. She seemed friendly enough, quiet, a little reserved, but not in a way that made me uncomfortable. She worked from home, which was nice because it meant we didn't have to coordinate schedules around who would be using the bathroom in the morning. I liked the idea of having a steady, calm presence in the apartment. The first few weeks went by without issue. We exchanged small talk when we crossed paths in the kitchen, shared the occasional meal, and otherwise respected each other's space. She'd occasionally ask if I wanted to join her for a walk or watch a movie, but I was always too tired or busy. The workday felt long, and I wasn't exactly in the mood to socialize. But then, little things started to change. I noticed Sarah seemed very interested in my schedule. At first, it wasn't anything alarming. She casually asked if I had plans for the weekend, what time I worked the next day, or if I had any errands to run. I figured she was just being friendly, trying to make conversation. Maybe she was just one of those people who liked to know what was going on in the lives of others. But after a while, it felt less like small talk and more like tracking. One evening, I was getting ready to leave for a dinner with a friend, and Sarah asked, "Oh, are you going to the Thai place on Maple Street again?" I froze for a moment, surprised. "Yeah." "How did you know?" She smiled, not in an awkward way, but in a way that made me feel uneasy. "You mentioned it last week." I just remember things. I shrugged it off, but something about the way she said it stuck with me. The next day, I found her in the living room while I was getting ready to leave for work. She was sitting on the couch, watching a show on her laptop. "Do you need anything from the store?" she asked casually. "No, I'm good," I said, grabbing my purse. "Why?" "I was just wondering if you needed any snacks. You usually buy the same kind of granola bars every week." That was strange. I hadn't mentioned my snacks to her, but she was right. I did buy the same ones every week. Still, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just an offhand observation. But then things got worse. Over the next few weeks, Sarah started commenting on more personal things. She'd ask about the photos I had around the apartment, about the books on my shelf. She'd ask if I had plans for my days off, how long I was planning to be at work, when I'd be coming home. And then, the worst part. I came back from work one afternoon and found that my makeup bag had been moved. I was sure I'd left it in the drawer by the bathroom sink, but now it was sitting on the edge of the countertop, a little too neatly arranged. At first, I thought maybe I'd just been forgetful. Maybe I'd moved it and didn't remember. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt wrong. The bag wasn't just moved, it was as if someone had gone through it. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid. I didn't want to accuse her of something without proof. Then, one night, I came home late. Sarah was already in bed, but I noticed the lights in the kitchen were on. I walked in, and she was sitting at the table, scribbling in a notebook. She looked up at me with wide eyes, almost startled. "Oh, hey. I didn't hear you come in." I nodded, trying to stay calm. "What are you doing up this late?" "Just writing." She smiled, but it wasn't a smile that put me at ease. It was too tight. I glanced at the notebook. "What are you writing about?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the pages. "Just some things. Stuff for work." I didn't press it any further, but the whole interaction felt off. The next morning, I woke up to find my car keys missing from the bowl by the door. I looked everywhere, but they were gone. I even checked Sarah's room, but the door was locked, and she wasn't home. It took me a few hours to find them, tucked into the pocket of the jacket I had left hanging on the back of the chair in the kitchen. I had no idea how they got there. That's when the thoughts started to pile up, one after another. Was I just overthinking things? Or was Sarah really doing something she shouldn't be? One evening, I decided to confront her. I had enough. "Sarah," I said, sitting across from her at the table, "I need to ask you something." She looked up from her phone, a little too quickly, as if she'd been waiting for this. "Sure, what's up?" "I've noticed some things, with my stuff, my schedule. And I just need to know if you've been going through my things." Her smile faltered for a split second, but then she regained her composure. "What do you mean?" "The makeup bag. The keys. You've been asking about my plans all the time. You know where I go and when I'm back. It's a little too much." She didn't react the way I expected. Instead of getting defensive or upset, she leaned forward, her expression unnervingly calm. "I'm just trying to be friendly, you know? I like getting to know people. And you're interesting. You have such an interesting routine. I was just curious." I couldn't breathe. I wasn't sure if I was scared or disgusted, but I knew then that I couldn't stay. I didn't want to feel like I was being watched in my own home. "I think I'm going to find a new place to live," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't look surprised. In fact, she smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile anymore. It was something darker. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "I understand," she said softly. "You'll be missed." That night, I packed my things. I didn't care about the rent I'd already paid. I didn't care about the mess I left behind. I just needed to get out. I didn't hear from her again after I moved out. No calls, no messages, no notes. I don't know if she was just being friendly or if she was keeping tabs on me. Either way, I didn't want to stick around long enough to find out. I still don't understand what was going through her head, and I don't know if she was actually dangerous or if I was just overreacting. It started like any other night. My friends and I had gone to a party at a house just off campus. It was the usual thing: loud music, red cups, and people laughing a little too loudly. Nothing out of the ordinary. I'd been to 100 parties like this before. You show up, you talk to people, maybe you drink a little, then you go home. Simple. That's how I met him, Ethan. He was standing by the kitchen counter when I walked in, talking to a couple of people I didn't know. I wasn't really looking to meet anyone, but he smiled and waved me over. I figured, why not? Maybe I'd find someone to talk to, maybe even make a new friend. I was new to the area, and most of my time was spent either in class or studying, so getting out was a nice change. Ethan was charming. Not in the way that made you feel like he was trying too hard, but just enough to make you feel comfortable. He had a friendly smile, a laid-back vibe, and we had some mutual friends. We started talking, and the conversation just flowed. He wasn't pushy or intense, but there was something about him that kept pulling me in. He asked where I was from, what I was studying, and we chatted about campus life. At first, everything felt completely normal. He made me laugh, and he seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. But as the night went on, I started noticing something. It wasn't anything huge, just little things that felt off. Every time I tried to walk away to talk to someone else, he'd follow me, like he didn't want to be separated. He would keep reappearing in the same places, even when I hadn't seen him for a while. After a few hours, I was ready to leave. I didn't know anyone very well at the party, and I wasn't in the mood to stay up late. I said goodbye to my friends and started heading for the door. But as I walked past the kitchen, there was Ethan again. He must have noticed I was leaving, because he immediately started walking toward me. "Hey, don't leave yet," he said, his voice a little too eager. I paused, feeling a little awkward. "I think I'm done for the night." "It's been fun, though." He smiled, but there was something in his eyes that made me hesitate. "I get it, but we should hang out sometime. Maybe grab a coffee? What's your number?" At that point, I was starting to feel uncomfortable. He seemed nice, but there was something about the way he kept asking that felt a little too intense. Still, I didn't want to be rude, so I gave him my number. It wasn't a big deal at first. He texted me the next day, saying he had a good time at the party and asking if I wanted to meet up for coffee sometime. I didn't think much of it. I responded, and we set a time. I went to the coffee shop, thinking it would just be a casual hangout. When I showed up, he was already there. We had a good time, at least, at first. He was easy to talk to, and I thought maybe I'd been reading too much into things. Maybe he was just a little clingy. We talked about our classes, campus events, and the usual small talk. But as the conversation went on, he started asking questions that felt a little too personal. "So, what are you doing later? Are you living in the dorms? Is it just you there?" I tried to brush it off, telling him I didn't have any big plans, just homework. But he kept pushing, asking about my roommates, about my schedule, and how often I was out. It started to feel invasive. I politely told him I had to go, and as I was leaving, he walked me to the door. "Hey, I'll walk you back to your dorm. It's not safe for a girl to be out here alone." I wasn't sure what to say. I didn't want to make him feel bad, but I also didn't want him to think I needed him to walk me back. So I told him I'd be fine and gave a half-hearted excuse about being in a rush. He smiled but didn't push it, which was a small relief. Over the next few weeks, things got weirder. Ethan started showing up outside my classes. I'd be walking to a lecture, and there he'd be, just standing there, waiting. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. But when I saw him the third time, I started to feel uneasy. He'd wave, walk up, and ask if I was heading to lunch or if I had time to grab a coffee. It wasn't just in the classroom building. He'd pop up outside the library or near the student center. Once, I had just finished a study session, and when I walked out, I saw him standing by a bench, looking around like he was waiting for someone. I was about to turn the other way when he spotted me and waved me over. At first, I thought maybe he just enjoyed talking to me, but I started to get this strange feeling. It wasn't just his constant appearances, it was how he acted when he saw me. He'd act like we were the best of friends, but it felt forced. Like he was trying too hard to convince me we were close. One evening, I came back to my dorm after a long day of classes, and when I opened the door to my room, I froze. I could have sworn I saw someone's shadow move past the window. I stepped back quickly and looked around. My heart started pounding. I hadn't seen Ethan in a few days, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was him. I checked the peephole on the door, but it was empty. Still, I couldn't relax. I didn't want to assume the worst, but my gut was telling me something wasn't right. I didn't see him again for a few days after that, but when I did, he was waiting outside my dorm building. I couldn't help but feel like he was watching me. It didn't take long for my friends to notice, either. I'd mentioned the weird occurrences, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. They assured me it was probably nothing, but the more time passed, the more convinced I was that something was off. I started avoiding the places I knew Ethan might show up. I changed the times I'd leave for class, took a longer route when I went to the library, and even started taking the bus instead of walking. But then, one day, when I was on my way back from the grocery store, I turned the corner to see Ethan standing across the street from my dorm. He was just standing there, staring. My heart dropped into my stomach. I quickly ducked behind a nearby car, hoping he hadn't seen me, but when I looked up again, he was gone. The next day, I didn't go to class. I called my mom and told her everything that had been happening. She was concerned, of course. She urged me to report him, but I was hesitant. What if I was overreacting? What if he was just being friendly? That evening, I got a text from Ethan, the first in a few days. It was short, but it made my skin crawl. I see you're avoiding me. I'll be outside your dorm at 8. We need to talk. I didn't respond. Instead, I blocked his number and made a plan to speak with campus security the next day. I never saw him again, at least not in the same way. When I bought my house, I was excited but nervous. It was my first home, and I knew there'd be a lot to learn. The neighborhood seemed nice enough, quiet, mostly older folks, nothing that stood out in a bad way. It felt like a good place to start fresh. I had only been there a few days when my neighbor introduced himself. His name was Dan. He came over while I was trying to figure out how to use the lawnmower that the previous owners had left behind. He was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, with a weathered face and a permanent smile. He carried a wrench in one hand, as if he had been in the middle of fixing something when he decided to come over. "Looks like you're figuring things out," he said, nodding at the mower. "Those older models can be tricky." I explained that it was my first time owning a house and that I wasn't great with tools. He offered to take a look at the mower, and within a few minutes, he had it running. I was grateful and thanked him more than once. He waved it off, saying he was happy to help. Over the next few weeks, Dan came by every so often. At first, it was always under the pretense of helping with something, tightening a loose faucet, showing me how to patch a small hole in the fence. He seemed like the kind of neighbor you'd be lucky to have. But then he started coming over just to chat. I didn't mind at first. I figured he was lonely or just friendly. But as time went on, his visits became more frequent. I'd hear his voice calling out from the yard while I was inside, or I'd see him standing at the edge of my property, looking over like he was about to walk in. He'd make comments about how quiet my place was or how I hadn't put up curtains yet. One day, I came home from work and found him in my backyard. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there. When I asked what he was doing, he smiled and said he noticed my gutter was sagging and thought he'd check it out for me. I hadn't asked him to, and I didn't even realize it needed fixing. I thanked him but told him I'd take care of it. He didn't seem offended, but there was a pause, a moment where he just stared at me, like he was trying to figure something out. Then he smiled again and said, "No problem." That was when I started feeling uneasy. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but I also didn't like the idea of someone coming into my yard without asking. I told myself he was just being helpful, maybe a little too eager. A week later, I woke up to the sound of someone knocking on my door. It was still early, barely light out. When I looked through the peephole, it was Dan. I didn't open the door right away. He was holding something, tools, I think, and when I asked what he needed, he said he noticed my porch light was flickering the night before and thought he'd fix it. I told him I was fine and that I'd handle it later. He stood there for a moment before walking away, but something about the way he moved felt wrong. Like he was annoyed but didn't want to show it. After that, I started locking everything. I had been lazy about it before since it felt like such a safe neighborhood, but now I made sure every window and door was secure before I went to bed. I even put a lock on the gate to my backyard. One night, I was in the living room when I heard a noise outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint scraping sound. I turned off the TV and listened. It was coming from the back door. My heart was pounding as I got up and walked over. When I looked through the small window, I saw the handle move, like someone was trying to open it. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen, just staring at the door. Then I heard a voice, Dan's voice. He called my name, quiet at first, then louder. "I know you're in there. Just wanted to see if you needed help with anything." I didn't answer. I backed away from the door and grabbed my phone, ready to call the police. But then he stopped. The handle stopped moving, and I heard his footsteps walking away. I didn't sleep that night. I kept looking out the windows, half expecting to see him standing there. The next morning, I found a screwdriver lying on my back porch, right near the door. I wanted to confront him, but I was scared. What if he got angry? What if it made things worse? Instead, I started looking into security systems. I bought cameras and installed one on the front porch and another in the backyard. The cameras made me feel a little better, but not completely. I was still on edge, still jumping at every sound. Then, a few nights later, I saw him on the camera feed. He was standing at my back gate, testing the lock. When he realized it was locked, he looked straight into the camera. He didn't smile. He didn't move. He just stared for what felt like forever before walking away. That was it for me. I called the police and told them everything. They came out and talked to him, but all he said was that he was trying to be helpful, that he didn't mean any harm. He promised to leave me alone, and for a while, he did. But I still see him sometimes. He stands at the edge of his property, watching me. He doesn't come over anymore, doesn't try to talk to me, but I can feel his eyes on me. I don't think he's forgotten. I don't think he ever will. The night started like any other. I had been at a friend's birthday party in the city, and it was getting late. I don't drink much, but the idea of dealing with the subway at that hour felt exhausting, so I ordered a rideshare to take me home. I'd done it dozens of times before. It felt normal, safe even, to just pull up the app and let someone else do the driving. The car that pulled up was a black sedan, the kind most drivers seem to have. The license plate matched, and the driver, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a friendly smile, waved as I approached. I opened the door and slid into the back seat. The interior smelled faintly of air freshener, something pine-scented, and the radio was playing quietly, some soft jazz I didn't recognize. "Hi, are you Emma?" he asked, glancing at me through the rearview mirror. "Yeah, that's me," I replied. "Great. Heading to Maplewood Lane?" "Yes, thanks." He nodded, and we pulled away from the curb. For the first few minutes, everything seemed fine. I scrolled through my phone, responding to a few texts and checking the news. The streets were quiet, the kind of calm you only get in the city late at night. But then, I noticed something strange. We weren't heading toward the main road I expected. Instead, he took a turn onto a side street I didn't recognize. At first, I thought maybe it was just a shortcut. Drivers do that sometimes to avoid traffic or get around construction. "Is this a faster way?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately, just gave a vague, "Yeah," something like that. His tone was casual, but there was something about it that felt off. I glanced at my phone, opening the rideshare app to check the route. That's when I noticed the tracker wasn't working. The map, which normally shows the car's movement in real time, was frozen. It showed us still sitting at the pickup spot. "Hey, I think there's something wrong with the app," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He glanced at me in the mirror again, his smile tight. "Yeah, that happens sometimes. Don't worry about it. I know where I'm going." My stomach tightened. Something about the way he said it felt too casual, too dismissive. I watched the streets more closely now, trying to figure out where we were. The buildings were unfamiliar, and the further we went, the fewer streetlights there were. I think you missed a turn," I said, my voice a little firmer this time. "Nah, this is better," he said. "Trust me." I didn't. My heart was starting to race now, and I could feel my palms sweating. I opened the app again, trying to re-enter the destination, but it wouldn't update. The car's motion wasn't showing at all. It was as if we weren't moving. "Can you please just follow the directions in the app?" I asked, trying to sound calm but assertive. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked, "So, you live alone out there, or you got roommates?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. It was so casual, but the implications made my skin crawl. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. He glanced at me again in the mirror. "Quiet type, huh? That's okay. I get it." I forced myself to speak. "I think I'll get out here. I'll just walk the rest of the way." He laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Out here? There's nothing around. It's not safe to walk at night, you know." The street we were on was empty, lined with warehouses and the occasional parked car. No houses, no stores, no people. He slowed the car slightly, almost as if to tease me, before speeding up again. I reached for my phone and called the emergency number listed in the app. Nothing. The call didn't connect. It was like my phone wasn't working at all. I tried calling 911 next, and thankfully, it started ringing. The driver noticed. "Who you calling?" he asked, his tone sharper now. I didn't answer, just stared at the screen, willing someone to pick up. The ringing seemed to go on forever, and I felt the panic rising in my chest. Finally, a dispatcher answered. 911, what's your emergency?" "I'm in a rideshare, and the driver isn't taking me where I need to go," I said quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know where I am, and the app isn't tracking the ride." The driver's eyes flicked to the mirror, and his smile was gone now. "Who are you talking to?" he asked, his voice tight and angry. I ignored him and kept talking to the dispatcher, describing the car, the driver, anything I could think of. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and that they were sending help. The driver's knuckles were white on the steering wheel now. "You're making a big deal out of nothing," he said, his voice low but tense. I was just trying to make conversation. "I want to get out," I said firmly. "Let me out of the car." He didn't answer. Instead, he sped up, taking another turn onto an even darker street. My heart was pounding, and I could barely breathe. I reached for the door handle, but the child locks were on. I was trapped. The dispatcher was still on the line, trying to keep me calm, but I couldn't focus on their words. All I could think about was getting out. Then, as we rounded a corner, I saw headlights ahead. Another car was coming toward us. Without thinking, I started banging on the window, yelling for help. The other car slowed as it passed, and I saw the driver staring at us. The rideshare driver swore under his breath and slammed on the brakes. "Fine," he said sharply. "Get out." I didn't wait for him to change his mind. As soon as he unlocked the door, I threw it open and jumped out. I stumbled onto the pavement, my knees scraping against the rough ground, but I didn't care. I ran toward the other car, waving my arms. The driver of the other car rolled down their window, and I breathlessly explained what had happened. They let me into their car and drove me straight to the nearest police station. The rideshare driver was caught a few hours later. Turns out, he wasn't even an official driver. He'd stolen someone else's account and had a history of similar incidents. I was lucky to get out when I did. It's been months since that night, and I still can't bring myself to use a rideshare app again. I keep thinking about what could have happened if that other car hadn't been there, if I hadn't managed to call for help. I don't think I'll ever forget the way his voice sounded, the way his smile faded when he realized I wasn't going to stay quiet. It happened a few weeks ago, and I still can't stop thinking about it. It started off as an ordinary drive, just me on a quiet road, the kind that goes on forever with hardly any traffic. I'd been out for a few hours, taking the back roads through the countryside. My goal was just to clear my head, enjoy some solitude. The sun had started to set, casting everything in a dim golden light, and the road was empty. It was peaceful. But then I saw him. He was standing at the side of the road, waving his arms like he was trying to flag me down. At first, I thought it was a person in trouble. Maybe their car had broken down or they needed directions. I was alone, and it was the kind of road where help could be a long time coming, so I thought I'd stop and see if he was okay. It wasn't until I was closer that I started to get a bad feeling. There was something off about the way he was standing, how rigid he seemed, like he was almost too still for someone who was supposedly in need. I slowed the car, my instincts telling me to at least be cautious. As I got closer, the man didn't step forward, just stood there with his arms out, still waving, his face impossible to read. I could see his eyes now. Something about them, it wasn't panic or desperation, but more like calculation. The pit of my stomach tightened, but I told myself not to overthink it. I wasn't a kid anymore, and it was probably fine. I stopped a few feet from him, rolled down the window, and asked, "Hey, you need some help?" He didn't immediately answer. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, then back at me, and finally nodded. "Yeah," he said, voice a little rough. "I've been walking for miles. My truck broke down back there. I don't know what happened to it. Can you give me a lift to the gas station, just a few miles up the road?" Something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. I could see that his clothes were dirty, but there wasn't any sign of a breakdown, no car nearby, no tools. Just this guy, standing on the side of the road, looking like he'd been out there for hours. I wanted to drive off, but I didn't want to seem rude. "Are you sure it's not far?" I asked, my eyes scanning the trees along the road behind him. "Yeah," he said quickly, shaking his head. "It's just up there. It's not far, I swear." I hesitated for a second longer, and that's when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. From behind the trees, figures started to emerge. At first, I thought maybe they were other travelers, but then I saw the way they moved, purposeful, deliberate. It wasn't the casual walk of someone on a hike. It was controlled. That's when everything hit me. A chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. These weren't just random people. I don't know how I knew, but I could tell. I quickly rolled the window up halfway, keeping my hand on the door handle, just in case. The first figure that came out was a man, tall and broad, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Behind him, two more people, a woman and another man. They all looked off, Their clothes were mismatched, like they had been wearing whatever they could find. They weren't acting normal either. Their eyes were fixed on me, and they were moving with intent. The man who'd been standing by the road had stopped waving and was just staring at me now, a strange half-smile forming on his lips. I could feel my heart racing as my mind went into overdrive, calculating escape routes. I glanced behind me, trying to figure out if I could make a fast getaway. The road stretched out for miles, and I had no idea what was out there. I tried to force myself to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. The man who'd been flagging me down took a step closer, his hand resting on the side of my car. "You know," he said, his tone changing, becoming smoother, more menacing, "we don't take kindly to people who don't help each other out around here." My throat tightened. I wasn't stupid. I knew I had to get out of there, fast. But just as I was about to shift into drive, the man placed his hand on my side mirror and leaned down. "It'd be better if you just got out of the car," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No reason to make this hard." The others had closed the distance now. The woman was smiling, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. The two men were standing off to the side, each of them looking ready to move at any moment. I froze, not knowing what to do, but my instincts kicked in. I slammed my foot on the gas, spinning the wheels on the gravel before I sped off, throwing up a cloud of dust in my rearview mirror. My heart was pounding in my chest as I looked back once, seeing them all standing there in the middle of the road, watching me drive away. It was only when I rounded a corner and they disappeared from view that I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, my hands still gripping the steering wheel as if I were holding on to my life itself. I didn't see them again, but I kept checking my mirrors the entire way, convinced they were somehow following me. I made it to the next town and found a small diner to stop at, where I called the police and explained everything. I wasn't sure if they would take me seriously, but they said they'd look into it. They told me to be cautious, but the road was too quiet and remote for them to have much information. I don't know who they were, but I'm glad I drove away. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed. I haven't gone back on that road since, and I don't think I ever will. Something about those people, I just knew they weren't out there for a friendly chat. And I still wonder if I was the only one they'd ever tried it with. It was supposed to be a simple, harmless adventure. A group of friends, bored with the usual weekend plans, decided to explore an abandoned construction site on the edge of town. We heard stories about it, mostly rumors, nothing solid about it being haunted or dangerous, but to us, it was just another place to check off our list of things to do. None of us thought anything serious would happen. We didn't expect to run into anyone, let alone someone who had been living there for who knows how long. The place had been deserted for years, no work being done on it. The concrete walls were half finished, the skeleton of the building rising up in jagged shapes where workers had clearly stopped. Broken windows, rusted metal, and piles of debris filled the area, making it feel like a ghost town. We thought it would be fun to just roam around, maybe snap some photos for the gram and see what was left behind. It was only supposed to be a quick trip. It was me, Chris, Danny, and Liam. We'd all been friends for a long time, and none of us had any qualms about sneaking into abandoned places. But this was different. We climbed over the gate at the edge of the site, which was easy enough since the lock was broken and the fence barely stood upright. The place felt off immediately, but none of us said anything. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the site, but we figured we'd be in and out before it got too dark. As we wandered deeper into the site, we joked and laughed. The silence was unsettling, though, in a way that didn't feel normal. It wasn't like other places we'd explored. There was something heavy in the air, like the kind of silence you get when you know someone is watching you, even though you can't see them. It should have been a clue, but we didn't listen to our instincts. We were near the farthest corner of the site when we heard the noise. It was faint at first, just the sound of something dragging, like fabric scraping across concrete. I froze, turning to look at the others. Danny had already stopped, and Chris was squinting into the shadows, trying to see what it was. We didn't move at first. The sound came again, closer this time, and then we saw it. A figure stepped into view. It wasn't anyone we knew. He looked like he had just crawled out from one of the ruins. Dirty, ragged clothes, his face covered in a thick beard, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was dragging something behind him. No, not something, someone. A bag, or maybe a tarp, but it looked like it was full of something heavy. We all stood still, unsure of what to do. My heart was hammering in my chest. Danny was the first to speak. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice wavering, but she tried to sound confident. The man didn't answer at first. He just stared at us, his eyes cold and calculating, as if he was trying to figure us out. "You shouldn't be here," he finally said, his voice low, almost too calm. There was a strange edge to it, like he was on the verge of something. We didn't move. None of us knew how to react. Was he a squatter? Was he living here, hiding out from something or someone? The air felt thick now, heavy with tension. It was clear that he wasn't happy to see us. "I said you shouldn't be here," he repeated, stepping forward. His eyes didn't leave ours. His hand reached down toward the bag at his side, but he didn't pull anything out. He just kept staring at us like he was waiting for someone to make the first move. I wanted to say something, to explain that we were just exploring, that we meant no harm. But my mouth was dry. I couldn't find the words. It was like the atmosphere had thickened around us, and I was suddenly too scared to speak. Chris took a step back, looking at the rest of us. His face was pale, and I could see him searching for an escape route in his mind. I could feel it, too. It wasn't safe anymore. The man's eyes narrowed as he saw Chris move. "No one's leaving," he said. His voice was much colder now, much more serious. Before any of us could react, he moved quickly, too quickly. He grabbed Liam by the arm, pulling him toward him with terrifying strength. Liam yelled, stumbling as the man yanked him forward, his hand tightening around his wrist like a vice. "Let him go!" Danny shouted, but the man didn't flinch. He dragged Liam with him to the nearby wall, slamming him against it with enough force that I heard a thud echo through the air. Liam was gasping for breath, clearly shocked, but still fighting back. His hands were free now, but the man was still holding him by the collar, pressing him against the crumbling concrete. "You don't belong here," the man said again, his voice cold and final. It all happened so fast. My mind was racing. I wanted to help Liam, but I didn't know what to do. Danny was frozen in place, her eyes wide with fear. I could feel my body shaking, and I couldn't seem to move. The man let go of Liam's collar and pushed him back, shoving him away like he was nothing more than an annoyance. Liam stumbled but didn't fall. The man looked at all of us, sizing us up. He took a slow, deliberate step back, still watching us. His hand slowly came up to his mouth, as if he were considering something. For a moment, there was silence. Then, he spoke again, his voice almost casual this time. "Get out. Now!" Before I changed my mind. We didn't wait around. We didn't argue. Without another word, we all turned and ran, sprinting back the way we had come. My heart was racing, and I could hear the others behind me, their footsteps heavy on the concrete. We didn't look back. We made it to the edge of the site, where the gate was. I don't think any of us stopped to breathe until we were out of the fence and onto the road. We didn't even slow down until we were far away, standing by the side of the road, trying to catch our breath. When I finally looked at the others, I saw how pale they were. We all knew we had barely made it out of that place, and none of us were going back. The man hadn't chased us. He hadn't shouted anything after us, but I could still feel his eyes on my back. Even now, I don't know what his intentions were, but I don't want to find out. It wasn't just a coincidence. He didn't want us there, and he made it clear. I don't know if he was living there or just hiding out, but whatever it was not a place for anyone else. It's been over a year now, but sometimes, when I think about it, I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did. Would he have let us go, or would he have done something worse? I'm glad I don't have to find out. It happened last summer, during a trip I'd been looking forward to for months. There were 5 of us friends who'd known each other for years, and this was supposed to be a relaxing weekend away from everything. A weekend of hiking, campfires, and just getting away from the noise of life. We had picked a remote spot for our campsite, a place that wasn't far from a scenic lookout. We set up camp and spent the day hiking to the spot, taking in the view, talking about everything and nothing. It was beautiful, the kind of place where you could just lose yourself in the moment. The weather was perfect, and everything felt right. That's why, when the time came to head back to camp, I didn't think twice about it. We started the hike back around mid-afternoon, all of us chatting as we walked, just like we had on the way there. The path was a little more challenging on the return trip, mostly downhill, but nothing too serious. Everyone was in good spirits, tired but happy. I remember feeling a little lighter, knowing we'd be back at camp soon, ready to relax and enjoy the evening. But then, when we reached a fork in the trail, I noticed that one of us, Tom, wasn't there. At first, I thought maybe he had just fallen behind, so I called out to him. "Tom? You good back there?" No answer. I figured maybe he had stopped to take a picture or rest for a minute. We'd been stopping here and there, so it wasn't unusual. I kept walking, thinking he'd catch up, but after a while, I started to get that feeling. You know, the one where something doesn't feel right, but you can't put your finger on it? I stopped again. "Tom?" Louder this time, more urgent. Still nothing. At this point, I turned around. I'd walked a little further than I realized. I looked down the trail, but there was no sign of him. No footsteps, no movement. It was as if he had just vanished. I started walking back in the direction we came from, calling his name, trying to keep my voice steady. The others had noticed by now, and they began calling for him too. We all split up, each of us taking a different path, looking for Tom. We didn't want to panic, but it was hard not to. We kept looking for what felt like hours, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no trail leading off the path, nothing that would tell us where he'd gone. I was starting to feel the panic rising in my chest, but I tried to keep it together. Tom was a big guy, he could handle himself. Maybe he'd just wandered off the path a little bit. Maybe he'd been ahead of us the whole time and we hadn't realized. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Deep down, I knew that if he was just ahead, he would have answered us by now. It wasn't until we all met back at the fork, empty-handed, that we decided to go back to camp. Maybe he'd gotten tired of searching and went back to wait for us. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut, that gnawing unease that something wasn't right. The hike back to camp felt longer than it should have. Maybe it was the quiet that made it seem that way. The silence was unnerving. Not a single bird chirped, no wind rustled through the trees. It was dead still, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. When we got back to camp, it was as if nothing had changed. The fire was still out, our tier was just where we'd left it. But there was something off. I didn't know what it was at first, but it hit me when I saw Tom's backpack still by the fire. His tent was still standing, his sleeping bag rolled up neatly inside. Everything was in place. Everything, except him. We all stood there in silence for a moment, just staring at his stuff. No one spoke. No one wanted to. I don't know how long we stood there, but the quiet was suffocating. None of us wanted to go inside the tents. No one wanted to be alone in that silence, but we couldn't ignore it. There were 5 of us, and Tom was supposed to be with us, but he wasn't. We called out for him again, our voices echoing into the dark, but there was no reply. I know I should have been more logical, but everything inside me was telling me something was wrong. Something had happened to him. I thought about going back out to look for him, but the thought of wandering those woods in the dark alone was terrifying. We didn't have a lot of light left, and the idea of searching for him with no real sense of direction, it wasn't safe. We all just kind of stood there, not knowing what to do. We decided to wait until morning. Maybe he'd come back. Maybe he'd gotten lost or hurt, and he was trying to make his way back. We kept the fire going, our voices quiet, too aware of the silence around us. It felt like the woods were closing in, like we were waiting for something. No one slept. We stayed by the fire, huddled together, watching the shadows move in the trees. Every crackling noise, every snap of a twig had us on edge. The hours dragged on, and the darkness seemed endless. In the morning, we woke up with a sense of dread that had been building all night. The fire had died down to embers, and the sun was barely up. We all looked at each other, but no one wanted to be the first to speak. We were all thinking the same thing. Tom was still gone. We decided to check the trail again, this time sticking together. We retraced every step we'd taken the day before, looking for anything that might explain what had happened. But the trail was still empty. There was nothing. Not a single clue to where he'd gone. No footprints, no sign of a struggle, no broken branches. And that's when we noticed it, something I had missed the first time we walked back to camp. His gear was untouched. The same backpack that had been sitting by the fire the night before was still there. His sleeping bag, his boots, even his jacket, all of it was just sitting there like he'd walked off and forgotten to take it with him. But that didn't make sense. If he'd left voluntarily, why would he leave everything behind? The woods were quiet. Too quiet. Not even the sound of the wind. Nothing. I don't know what happened to him. I don't think we'll ever know. But I know that I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something else was out there, something that didn't want us to leave, didn't want us to find Tom. The whole experience left me with more questions than answers. Tom never came back, and no one ever found any sign of him. It felt like he had just disappeared. To this day, when I think back on that weekend, I can't stop wondering, did we miss something? Or did we just make the wrong decision by staying? I went camping alone up in the mountains last spring, just to get away from everything for a few days. It's something I like to do from time to time, the quiet, the solitude, the chance to just clear my mind. I'm not someone who gets nervous easily, especially not in nature. I've been on countless hikes and camping trips. So, when I set up camp at a little clearing just off the main trail, I thought it would be another peaceful night. The weather was perfect, and I was feeling good. I had a small fire going, just enough to cook my dinner and keep the bugs away. It was about dusk, and I was sitting on a log by the fire, eating some canned chili. That's when I heard footsteps. At first, I figured it was a deer or some other animal, but the sound was too steady, too deliberate. I tensed up, standing up slowly and turning toward the noise. Out of the trees stepped a man, maybe in his mid-30s. He looked scruffy, hair long and unkempt, clothes worn and dusty, like he'd been walking for a long time. He didn't look dangerous at first, but something about the way he approached made my stomach tighten. He smiled, and I could tell it wasn't the kind of smile that made you feel at ease. "Hey there," he said, his voice rough, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. "You got a minute?" I was hesitant but didn't want to be rude. "Sure. What's up?" "I'm just lost," he said, walking closer to my fire. "Been walking for hours, trying to find the trail again. You wouldn't happen to have a map, would you?" I glanced at the small map I had tucked in my bag and then back at him. Something felt off. His clothes were too worn for someone just out for a hike, and there was a smell to him, damp, musty, and a little like sweat. But I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I offered him a quick smile. "Yeah, I've got one, but I'm not sure you're too far off the trail. You should be able to find it if you head north." He nodded like he was listening, but then just stood there. And for a moment, he didn't say anything. His eyes just stayed on me, almost studying me, like he was trying to figure something out. I didn't like the way he was looking at me. It felt like he wasn't interested in finding the trail anymore, like he was waiting for me to invite him to stay. "You camping out here?" he asked, his voice much softer now, like we were having a casual conversation. I wasn't sure how to answer. The tone of his voice had shifted. He wasn't just lost anymore. He was interested in something else. "Yeah, just for a few nights." He nodded again, taking a few steps closer to the fire. Too close. I took a step back without thinking, suddenly feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't want to be rude, but I wasn't about to let some random guy get too close to me in the middle of nowhere. "You alone?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Seems kind of dangerous out here all by yourself, don't it?" I forced a smile, trying to keep the conversation light. "It's not too bad. I'm used to it." He didn't seem convinced. "You ever worry someone might show up, though?" "Someone like me?" That hit me like a cold wave, and I froze. His words hung in the air, almost like a threat disguised as a joke. I didn't know if I should laugh it off or if I should take it seriously. I decided not to engage, hoping he'd get the hint. "Look, I should probably get some sleep," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's getting late." But he didn't move. Instead, he leaned against a tree, just standing there, staring at me with that same unsettling gaze. "You got a tent set up, or are you just sleeping under the stars?" he asked, his voice calm, but there was something in it, something almost too calm, like he was probing for more. I didn't answer right away. I was trying to keep my thoughts together, but the unease I felt was growing. I glanced at my tent, then back at him. His posture had changed. He was no longer just standing still. He was leaning in slightly, almost like he was waiting for me to say something, anything. "I'm good for the night," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm just gonna get some rest. You should probably head out before it gets too dark." But he didn't leave. He just kept standing there. I could hear him shifting, like he was trying to make himself comfortable without really moving away. I tried to stay calm, but everything inside me was screaming to just get in the tent and zip myself up. The man took a step closer. "You ever think about what would happen if someone didn't leave?" That was it. That was the moment I realized I was dealing with someone who wasn't just lost. He wasn't just a drifter passing through. He was trying to make me feel small, make me uncomfortable, make me unsure. And in that moment, I knew I had to act. "I think you should go," I said, my voice low but firm. "Now." His smile didn't fade, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something that made the blood in my veins freeze. For a second, he just stood there, looking at me like he was trying to decide whether to push it further. Then, without saying another word, he turned and started walking away, his footsteps slow and deliberate, almost like he was savoring the moment. As he moved further into the trees, I couldn't help but watch him, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence that followed was deafening, and I was still holding my breath, waiting for him to turn around, to come back, too. But he didn't. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours lying in my tent, listening to the noises around me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind in the trees, made my heart race. I was afraid to fall asleep, afraid that he'd come back, or worse, that he'd already be waiting for me outside. At dawn, I packed up my things and left. I didn't care about the hike I had planned. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. I didn't look back. I couldn't. As I drove away, I kept thinking about the way he'd looked at me, about his words. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had known exactly what he was doing. And if I hadn't stood my ground, I don't know what might have happened. I haven't been camping since. I don't know if I ever will again. I can't get the image of him standing there, just watching me, out of my head. I don't think I'll ever feel safe out there again. I still can't shake the feeling. The cold, wet air. The sound of my own breath mixed with the pounding rain. And that feeling of someone watching, someone just behind me, every step of the way. It started like any other run. I was out on my usual route, the kind of run I do when I need to clear my head. The rain had been coming down hard all day, and I wasn't about to let that stop me. I had my head up, my shoes splashing through the puddles, and the rhythmic sound of my footsteps in my ears. The world felt distant, the streets quieter than usual, the kind of night where everything seems muffled by the storm. It wasn't until I was about halfway through that I noticed it. At first, I thought it was just the noise of the rain, maybe some stray footsteps from someone else running nearby. But then I realized. The footsteps were too close, too in sync with mine. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just my imagination, but it didn't stop. Every time I picked up the pace, the footsteps behind me quickened. Every time I slowed down, they slowed too. I glanced over my shoulder once, quickly, just to see if anyone was there. Nothing. Just the rain, the street lights reflecting off the wet pavement. But when I turned my head back, I could hear it again, the footsteps, still right behind me. I could feel my heart starting to race, the anxiety creeping up in my chest. Who would be out here in this weather, running so close? I sped up, thinking maybe I was just paranoid, but they kept matching my pace. The sound of those steps, heavy, deliberate, was starting to make my skin crawl. I had to stop. I needed to see who it was, to confront them. If someone was behind me, they were clearly following me, and I wasn't about to be caught unaware. I turned sharply to the side, slipping slightly on the wet pavement as I came to a stop, but still keeping my eyes on the street behind me. My breath was coming out in clouds, but I couldn't stop looking, couldn't stop listening. For a moment, I heard nothing. No footsteps, no movement. The rain kept falling, louder now, the only sound in the empty street. Then I heard it again. The footsteps. But this time, they were closer. I tensed, standing there in the rain, just waiting. My nerves were shot, every muscle in my body screaming for me to either run or confront whoever it was. I chose to turn around and face whatever was coming. And there he was. A man, just a few feet away, standing in the rain, looking at me with this intense, unsettling stare. I couldn't see much of his face. He had a dark hoodie pulled up over his head, the fabric soaked through. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket, but I could tell his posture was stiff, almost like he was waiting for something. I took a breath, trying to stay calm. "You following me?" I asked, my voice shaky but firm. The man didn't answer at first. He just stood there, staring at me. I felt the tension between us building, something in the air thickening with the promise of something bad. My pulse was racing, and I could feel my legs starting to shake. But I wasn't about to let him see that. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, almost a growl. "You're in my way." I didn't know what he meant by that. I didn't know if he was talking about the street or something else, but his tone was all wrong. There was no reason for him to be this close, this intense. I didn't know if he was threatening me or just crazy, but I knew I had to get out of there. I took a step back, trying to put some space between us. "I'm just running." "I don't want any trouble," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could, though inside, I was panicking. The man didn't move. He just stood there, still staring at me. And then, before I could even think, he took a step forward. It was sudden, fast, and without warning. I froze, my feet rooted to the wet pavement. "What do you want?" I demanded, louder now, more desperate. I had to keep control. I had to. I wasn't about to get caught in this situation. But as I stepped back again, he took another step closer, closing the distance between us. The man's eyes narrowed. "I'm not done with you," he said, each word dripping with something dark, something threatening. I turned and ran. I didn't think about it, didn't hesitate for a second. I bolted down the street, heart pounding in my chest, every step faster than the last. The sound of the rain in my ears, the sloshing of my shoes in the puddles, none of it mattered. I couldn't hear anything but my own frantic breath and those footsteps, now echoing in time with mine. He was still behind me. I could hear him gaining on me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I could feel his presence, like he was inches away, waiting for the right moment to grab me. The rain was coming down harder now, a blur of water, and I could barely see. My legs burned with the effort, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Now I had no idea what this man wanted or how far he was willing to go. I turned down a side street, hoping to lose him, hoping he would just give up and turn away. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were right there. Closer now. I didn't know what he would do when he caught me. I didn't want to find out. I spotted a row of houses up ahead, the lights from the windows offering a glimmer of safety. I pushed myself harder, pumping my legs, not daring to slow down. I was almost there. I was almost safe. Then, just as I reached the sidewalk near the houses, the footsteps stopped. The sound of them, the heavy, deliberate steps, just cut off. For a second, I thought maybe he had given up. I didn't want to risk looking back, but something told me that it was too quiet now. Too still. I slowed my pace, but I didn't stop. I kept walking, the anxiety still crawling under my skin, the feeling of being hunted lingering in the air. And just as I was about to turn the corner, I heard the voice again. Low. Menacing. "You can't run forever." I didn't stop running until I was inside the first house I found, knocking frantically on the door, not even caring if I looked crazy. When the door opened, I practically collapsed, still shaking, still drenched from the rain. The woman who answered looked at me in confusion, but when I explained what had happened, she let me in without a word. I don't know how I made it through the rest of the night, but I did. I never saw the man again. But I can't stop thinking about him, about the way he followed me, about the way he spoke, like it wasn't just about running anymore. I don't know if he was just trying to scare me or if he had something worse planned. But the whole night feels like a blur, just the sound of rain and footsteps, and his voice. I haven't gone for a run since. It was late, and the rain hadn't let up for hours. The roads were nearly empty, just the occasional flash of headlights from passing cars. I was driving back from my sister's place, a good 2-hour drive from where I lived. I'd left later than I planned, and now it was almost midnight. The rain was coming down so hard that the wipers barely kept up, smearing water across the windshield more than clearing it. I was already tense, gripping the steering wheel tightly, trying to focus on the slick road ahead. I saw him just past the bend in the road. At first, it was just a blur, a figure standing on the shoulder, hunched against the rain. As I got closer, my headlights lit him up. He was soaked to the bone, wearing a dark jacket that clung to his frame, water dripping from his hair and face. His arm shot out, thumb extended, the universal signal for a hitchhiker. I don't know why I slowed down. Maybe it was the rain, or the fact that he looked miserable standing there in the middle of nowhere. Maybe it was guilt, thinking how I'd feel if I were stranded out here in weather like this. Either way, I pulled over. He jogged up to the car, water splashing around his boots. When I rolled down the window, he bent down, and I got my first good look at him. He looked to be in his late 30s, early 40s maybe. His face was pale, water streaming down his cheeks. His eyes were wide, almost too wide, and he was breathing hard like he'd been running. "Thanks, man," he said, his voice low but strained. "I've been out here for hours. You're a lifesaver." I hesitated for a moment, then unlocked the door. He climbed in quickly, shaking off the rain as best he could, though it didn't help much. The smell of wet clothes filled the car immediately. He shivered as he buckled himself in. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Just up the road," he said, pointing vaguely ahead. "Not far." I nodded and pulled back onto the road. The rain hammered against the roof, and the sound of the wipers filled the silence between us. I tried not to stare at him, but I couldn't help glancing over every few seconds. He sat stiffly, his hands resting on his knees, his head tilted slightly down. His jacket was zipped up tight, but something about the way he held himself made me uneasy. "You, got stuck out here?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "Car broke down," he said quickly. "Back there a ways." "Did you call someone?" He shook his head. "Phone's dead." I didn't push it. Something about his tone made me want to drop the subject. Instead, I focused on the road, though my grip on the wheel tightened. The minutes stretched on, and the tension in the car grew. He didn't say much, just stared straight ahead. I kept telling myself I was overthinking it, that he was just cold and tired. But there was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The way he sat, too still. The way his eyes darted to the rearview mirror every so often, like he was checking for something or someone. After a while, he shifted in his seat. I caught the movement out of the corner of my eye and glanced over. That's when I saw it, a handle sticking out from inside his jacket. At first, I thought maybe it was a tool, a flashlight or something. But then he adjusted his jacket, and I saw the glint of metal. A knife. A long one. My stomach dropped. I kept my face as neutral as I could, but inside, my mind was racing. Why was he carrying a knife? And why was he trying to hide it? I forced myself to stay calm, my hands steady on the wheel. I didn't want him to know I'd seen it. "So, I said, Keeping my tone light, how far did you say you needed to go? Just a bit further, he said, his voice low. I'll tell you where to stop. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed a plan, but I couldn't think straight. The rain was still coming down hard, the road stretching endlessly ahead. There wasn't another car in sight. I couldn't pull over now with him sitting there, the knife hidden in his jacket. I couldn't speed up or swerve, he'd notice. Then he spoke again, and his voice sent a chill down my spine. You live around here? He asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. No, I lied quickly. Just passing through. He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on me. You seem like a nice guy, he said. Not many people would stop for a stranger these days. I didn't respond. My throat felt dry, my pulse thundering in my ears. I focused on the road, hoping, praying for a sign of another car, a gas station, anything. But the road was dark and empty, just the endless rain and the shadows of trees on either side. He shifted again, and I felt the air in the car grow heavier. You ever wonder, he said suddenly, what you'd do if you were in the wrong place at the wrong time? The question hung in the air, cold and sharp. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The silence stretched on, and I realized I had to do something. I couldn't just keep driving, waiting for him to make a move. I glanced at the dashboard, pretending to check the fuel gauge. Damn, I muttered, loud enough for him to hear. I think I'm running low on gas. I might need to pull over soon. He didn't respond right away. When I glanced over, his eyes were on me, unblinking. There's a station up ahead, he said finally. Keep going. I nodded, my grip tightening on the wheel. My mind raced, trying to figure out my next move. If I could get to the station, maybe there'd be people there. Or at least a chance to get out of the car. But then he did something I didn't expect. He reached into his jacket, slowly, deliberately. My breath caught, my knuckles white on the wheel. But instead of pulling out the knife, he pulled out a phone. He held it up, tapping the screen a few times. The glow lit up his face, casting shadows across his sharp features. You said your phone was dead, I said before I could stop myself. He smiled, a cold, humorless smile. Guess I lied, he said. That was it. I couldn't wait any longer. I hit the brakes hard, the car skidding slightly on the wet road. What the hell are you doing? He shouted, but I didn't answer. As soon as the car stopped, I threw it into park and bolted up the door, rain pouring down on me as I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just ran, the rain soaking through my clothes, my feet slipping on the wet pavement. I heard him shout behind me, the car door slamming, but I didn't dare turn around. I ran until I saw headlights in the distance, waving my arms frantically as a truck approached. The driver stopped, and I stumbled toward him, gasping for breath. Help, I managed to say. Someone's after me. The truck driver didn't ask questions. He let me climb in, and we sped off, leaving the car and the hitchhiker behind. I don't know what he wanted or what he planned to do, but I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. I was in a rush that day. I had just finished an important meeting for work, and I needed to get to my next appointment on time. I didn't want to waste time waiting for a taxi, so I opened up the carpool app on my phone and booked a ride. It was one of those things I'd used a few times before, but I had never really thought much about it until that day. The driver's name popped up on my phone, Derek. His profile picture looked like it was taken in a park, with the sun shining behind him. It looked normal enough. I confirmed the ride, and within minutes, I saw his car pulling up outside the building. When I opened the door and got in, everything seemed fine. He greeted me with a smile, and I nodded back, not thinking too much of it. The car was clean, a little older than I expected, but still fine for a quick ride. I didn't really pay attention to the details of his appearance at first. I just wanted to get to my destination and get on with my day. I gave him the address for my next meeting, and we pulled away from the curb. We started out like any normal ride. The usual small talk. He asked how my day was going, if I had any plans for the weekend. I didn't mind, though. I wasn't in the mood to talk much, but I gave him short answers. The ride felt uneventful. But after a few minutes, I noticed something. I didn't recognize the streets he was taking. At first, I thought maybe he was just taking a different route, or maybe there was traffic on the usual road. But the streets were getting quieter. The buildings were looking more rundown. We were moving further away from the busy part of the city where my meeting was supposed to be. "Excuse me, I think you've missed my stop," I said, trying to stay calm, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond immediately, just kept driving. The silence between us grew thick. I tried again, a little firmer this time. "I need to go to, address." "You're going the wrong way." He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes catching mine. There was something about the way he looked at me that made my stomach twist. It wasn't that he seemed angry or even annoyed. It was more like he wasn't really hearing me. His eyes had an almost vacant look to them. I know, he said, his voice calm, too calm. "I'll get you there. Just a little detour first, don't worry." A detour? That didn't make sense. I had used the app enough times to know that the usual route was straightforward, nothing complicated, no detours. My office wasn't far from where I had been dropped off, and the destination was right in the middle of a busy part of the city. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice now a little tighter. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he just kept driving, taking a sharp turn onto a street I didn't recognize. I could feel my nerves start to tighten. Something was wrong. My instinct told me that I needed to get out of the car. I reached for my phone in my bag, ready to text my colleague or call for help, but I didn't want to make any sudden movements. I didn't know this man. I didn't know what he might do. "Could you stop the car, please?" I asked, my voice much more forceful now. "I'm not comfortable with this." He finally spoke again, but his tone had changed. It wasn't casual anymore. It was almost cold, like he wasn't speaking to a passenger anymore. "I told you, don't worry. We're almost there." That's when I noticed it. The neighborhood was getting worse. The buildings were crumbling, the streets were barely lit, and there weren't many cars on the road. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This was not the area I needed to be in. I wasn't familiar with this place, but I could tell it was a bad part of town. The kind of place you didn't go alone, especially not when the sun was setting. I started to panic, but I didn't want to let him know. I tried to keep my voice steady when I spoke again. "I really need you to stop, right here. Please." He looked at me through the rearview mirror again, and this time, there was something off about his smile. It wasn't a friendly smile anymore. It was more like a knowing grin, the kind that made my blood run cold. "Just relax," he said, his voice low. "You're going to be fine." I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my hands sweating as I gripped my phone tighter. The fear was starting to wash over me now, and I didn't know how to shake it. I had been in uncomfortable situations before, but this was different. This wasn't a normal ride. Suddenly, he turned the car down an alleyway. It was so dark I could barely see anything outside. I was starting to feel trapped, completely at his mercy. I had no idea where we were going, and I had no idea how to get out of this situation. I tried to reach for the door handle, but the locks clicked in place. "Stop the car," I said, my voice cracking. "Please. I need to get out. Now." But he just kept driving. I could hear him humming to himself, the sound making the entire situation feel even more surreal. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait for whatever he was planning. I knew I had to act fast. In one swift motion, I unlocked the door and flung it open. The car was moving slowly enough that I could jump out without injuring myself. My feet hit the pavement, and I ran without looking back. I didn't care if he followed me. I didn't care if he came after me. All I cared about was getting away from that car, from him. I didn't even stop to check if anyone was around. I just ran. I don't know how far I ran, but eventually I found a busy street. People were walking around, and I could see a store with lights on. I ran into the store, breathless, my heart still pounding in my chest. The store clerk gave me a strange look, but I didn't care. I told them I needed to call the police, and they let me use the phone. When the police arrived, they checked the area for the car. They found it a few blocks down, parked and empty. No sign of the driver. They said they would investigate, but honestly, I was too shaken to think about it much more. I just wanted to get out of that area. I never used the carpool app again after that. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something worse. Something I couldn't even put into words. I still don't know what that man's intentions were. But I know one thing for sure, he wasn't planning to take me where I needed to go. And I'm just thankful I got out in time. It had been raining for hours by the time we decided to stop for the night. The forecast had said scattered showers, but it turned into a steady downpour that turned the dirt roads into slippery paths. Our plan was simple: drive out to the woods, set up camp, and get away from everything for a weekend. It was supposed to be a break from work, stress, all that. None of us thought to check if the spot we picked was public land. It just looked like a good place to pitch a tent, and it was getting dark fast. There were 4 of us: me, Jason, Claire, and Matt. We parked near a clearing by the trees. It wasn't an official campsite, but it looked secluded and quiet. We got the tents up quickly despite the rain. The sound of the drops hitting the canvas was loud but kind of calming. After that, we sat around under a tarp Jason had brought, trying to keep the fire going with damp wood. We laughed a bit, told some stories, but we were all soaked, so the fun didn't last long. By 11, we gave up and went to bed. It must have been around 2 in the morning when I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The rain had lightened up, just a faint tapping against the tent now. Everything was quiet except for that. I thought maybe I had heard an animal or something, but when I listened closer, I heard voices. Low, angry voices. I unzipped the sleeping bag carefully and leaned toward the tent door, straining to hear. Jason's tent was closest to mine, and I could hear him whispering to someone. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but the tone wasn't good. He sounded scared. Then I heard another voice, deep and sharp, cutting through the rain. "You've got no right to be here," it said. I froze. I could tell it wasn't one of us, and it was angry. I peeked through the small mesh window on the tent and saw a flashlight beam swinging around outside. It landed on Jason's face for a second, and he winced. The light moved, and then I saw him, an older man, tall and broad, wearing a camo jacket and a white-brimmed hat. He was holding a rifle. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. The man pointed the rifle at the ground near Jason's feet and barked, "You think you can just walk onto someone's property and do whatever you like? Who gave you permission?" Jason stammered something about not knowing, about it being an accident. The man didn't seem to care. His voice got louder. "An accident? You think that makes it okay? You've got 10 seconds to pack up and leave, or I'll make you leave. You hear me?" I wanted to get up, to help Jason somehow, but I was terrified. I didn't know if the man would see me as a threat or if he'd just turn the gun on me too. I stayed crouched in the tent, gripping my phone, even though I had no signal out here. Claire must have heard it too, because I saw the light from her phone flashlight flicker on in her tent. That was a mistake. The man noticed it immediately. "Who else is out here?" he shouted, swinging the rifle toward her tent. He stomped toward it, the beam of his flashlight bouncing wildly as he moved. "Come out. Now!" Jason tried to say something, maybe to calm him down, but the man shoved him backward. Jason stumbled and fell, landing hard in the mud. Claire unzipped her tent slowly and stepped out with her hands up, shaking. Matt's tent was still zipped shut, no movement from inside. He was either frozen like me or still asleep somehow. The man's face was pale and lined, and his eyes were wild. He waved a rifle between Jason and Claire, spitting questions. "How many of you are there? What are you doing here? You spying on me?" Claire stammered something about just camping, just passing through. The man didn't seem to believe her. He kept muttering under his breath, things like, "liars," and "think you can sneak around my land." Then he looked at her tent, then Jason's, then mine. His eyes narrowed. "There's more of you, isn't there? Come out, all of you." I didn't know what to do. If I stayed hidden, he might think we were trying to trick him, but if I came out, I didn't know what he'd do. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. Finally, I unzipped the tent slowly, keeping my hands visible. I stepped out into the wet grass, my socks soaking through instantly. The man stared at me, his jaw tight. "Another one," he said, almost to himself. He pointed the rifle toward the last tent of Matt's. "What about him?" Before I could answer, Matt's tent unzipped. He came out with his hands up like the rest of us, his face pale and scared. The man stared at all four of us, his flashlight flickering over each of our faces. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just breathed heavily. Then he spat on the ground and said, "You've got 5 minutes. Pack up and get off my land. If I see you here again, I'll shoot first and ask questions later." None of us moved right away. He shouted, "Now," and that got us going. We scrambled to take down the tents, our hands fumbling with the wet fabric and slippery poles. The man stood there the whole time, his rifle resting on his hip, watching us with cold eyes. It took longer than 5 minutes, but he didn't stop us. He just kept muttering to himself, shaking his head like we'd done something personal to him. When we finally had everything packed, we started toward the car. Jason tried to apologize again, but the man cut him off. "Just go," he said. "And don't come back." We didn't need to be told twice. We piled into the car, and Jason started it up, the tires spinning a little in the mud before catching. As we drove away, I looked back and saw the man still standing there, his flashlight beam following us until we were out of sight. We didn't stop driving until we hit the main road, miles away. No one said much after that. We just sat there, soaked and shaken, the rain still pounding on the roof. We knew we'd been lucky. The man could have done a lot worse than yell at us. I still think about him sometimes, the way he looked at us, like we weren't people, just intruders. It makes me wonder what he was so afraid of or what he was hiding. I don't know how to explain what happened that night, but I know I'll never forget it. I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear footsteps outside my tent, even though I know I'm safe now. I've been camping a lot in my life, mostly by myself. It's the only way I can really clear my head, get away from everything, and just think. I'd gone out to a remote site in the woods, not too far from town, but far enough that I was pretty much alone. The kind of place where you're not likely to run into anyone. It was my second night out there. I had set up camp by a small creek, surrounded by tall trees. The sun had set hours ago, and the fire had burned down to embers. I was inside my tent, reading a book and listening to the sounds of the night. It wasn't a full moon, but the sky was clear, and there was just enough light from the stars and the glow of the embers to see a little around the campsite. Around 1 a.m., I started hearing something. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but then I realized it was something more distinct: footsteps. I didn't want to overthink it, but they were too close, too deliberate. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps were light, but they were steady and moving around the perimeter of my tent, circling it. I lay there in the dark, tense, unsure of what to do. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the steps weren't the kind you'd expect from wildlife. They were heavier, more purposeful. I heard them pause for a moment, then resume walking. My mind raced. Could it be another camper? Was someone lost? But I hadn't seen anyone else around. There were no other camps nearby, and the thought of someone else being out here this late walking around my tent, so close, was enough to make my stomach twist. I couldn't help myself. I had to look. Slowly, I unzipped the tent just a little and peered out into the dark. The forest was eerily quiet now. No more footsteps. It was hard to see much beyond the reach of the dim light from my campfire. The shadows of the trees stretched across the ground, but there was nothing there. No person, no animal, nothing. I shut the tent flap quickly, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to think, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been right outside, watching. It felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I spent the next few hours awake, listening for any other sounds. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me tense up. I didn't sleep at all. I kept expecting to hear the footsteps again, but nothing came. Finally, around 4 a.m., I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of birds chirping, sunlight peeking through the fabric of my tent. I lay there for a moment, trying to calm myself down. The night felt like a strange dream, but I knew it wasn't. The footsteps, the silence, the feeling that someone had been so close it was real. I didn't even want to check outside, but I knew I had to. I needed to see if anything was out of place, or if I was just being paranoid. I unzipped the tent slowly, carefully, and stepped outside. The air was cool, and the ground was damp with morning dew. The fire was just a pile of cold ashes now, and everything was still. At first glance, it seemed like nothing had changed. But then I noticed something. My gear, my backpack, and some of the other things I had left around the tent had been moved. Not by a lot, but enough that it wasn't where I'd left it. My backpack, which had been leaning against a tree, was now lying a few feet away, half open. My water bottle had been knocked over, and the small flashlight I always kept by my side was in a different spot than I remembered. It wasn't a huge mess, but it was clear that someone had been through my things. My stomach turned. I checked the rest of the camp. The area around the tent was untouched, but I still had that sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. I walked over to the creek and looked down at the water. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. That someone had been watching me all night. The worst part was the silence. There were no other campers nearby. No one else in the woods. The footsteps I heard, they couldn't have been from an animal. No animal would have been so close to my tent and walked around it in such a deliberate way. I couldn't explain it. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, trying to get out of there. I wasn't going to stay another night. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. Something wasn't right. Whoever had been out there, they knew I was alone. And I had no idea if they were still out there, waiting. As I loaded up my gear into my truck, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone walking toward me from the trees. But there was nothing. Just the woods, quiet as ever. I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The footsteps. The way everything had been moved. I don't know if I'll ever understand who or what it was. But I know I'm never camping alone in those woods again. The thought that someone could be out there, watching, that close, it's something I can't shake. I've been camping a lot, and I've always loved the solitude that comes with being in the wilderness. I'm not the kind of person who gets scared easily, especially when I'm out in nature. I usually find peace there. But what happened to me last year, in a remote spot I'd never been to before, has completely changed the way I think about being alone in the woods. It started out like any other solo trip. I found a spot off the beaten path, no one around for miles, just me and the trees. I set up my tent as usual, made a small fire, and started cooking dinner. The air was crisp, and it was quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves. Nothing unusual. Just the kind of peaceful, serene setting I had been craving. That night, after I had eaten and the fire had died down, I crawled into my sleeping bag, tired but content. The night was cold, the kind of cold that makes you appreciate being tucked inside a warm sleeping bag. The wind picked up a little, making the trees sway. Everything was calm until I heard it. At first, it was just a faint sound, a soft crunch of dirt or leaves. I figured it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, moving through the forest. But then it stopped. Just like that. I froze, listening. Everything went quiet. A few minutes passed, and I tried to settle back down, thinking it was nothing. But then I heard it again. The crunching sound, this time louder. Closer. My heart started to beat faster. I tried not to overthink it. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was the wind. I pulled the covers tighter and listened again. There it was. Footsteps. No animal would make that kind of sound. These were heavy, deliberate steps. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving slowly, carefully, as if they were trying not to make noise, but failing. I couldn't help it. I grabbed the flashlight I always keep by my side and unzipped the tent a little, just enough to peek outside. The night was pitch black, except for the glow of my campfire, which had nearly burned out. The light barely reached beyond the small circle around the fire. But in that small light, I didn't see anything. No movement. No figure. Just shadows. I waited a few more minutes, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Probably just a raccoon or some other animal. But the footsteps started again. Only this time, they were closer. A lot closer. I could hear them clearly, and they weren't moving like an animal. It was human, or at least, something walking like a human. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I had to do something. I grabbed my knife for protection and unzipped the tent fully, stepping outside, shining my flashlight in every direction. The air was still and cold. The footsteps stopped as soon as I was outside, but I couldn't see anyone. No movement. I checked the surrounding trees, the shadows, but everything was still. My heart was pounding in my chest. I stood there for a long moment, listening. The only sounds I could hear were the wind and the occasional crackling from my campfire. There was no one. I started to think I was just imagining things. I was alone. I knew I was alone. But then, just as I was about to go back into the tent, I heard it again. This time, it was behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The footsteps stopped again, and I felt that strange, uneasy silence surrounding me. My instincts were telling me to stay calm, but I was scared. I don't scare easily, but that night, alone in the dark, I felt like something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the night awake, lying there with the knife in my hand, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Every time I almost drifted off, I'd hear the footsteps again. They seemed to be circling me, like whoever it was knew I was listening and was waiting for me to let my guard down. It felt like they were taunting me, getting closer every time, but when I tried to confront them, they would stop, leaving me in a tense, silent waiting game. Hours passed like this. Finally, when the first light of morning broke through the trees, I heard nothing anymore. The footsteps stopped for good. I didn't sleep at all that night, just kept my eyes open, waiting, hoping the morning would bring some relief. And when I finally saw the sun starting to rise, I packed up my things quickly. I wasn't staying another minute. When I got out of the tent to stretch my legs and gather my stuff, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Around my campsite, all the way around the fire pit and my tent, were muddy footprints. They weren't animal tracks. These were human tracks, big ones, like a man's boots. And they were all over the place, going in circles around my camp, getting close to my tent, and then veering off. There was no mistaking it. Someone had been there. Someone had been walking around my tent all night, and I didn't hear them leave. I couldn't make sense of it. The tracks were fresh, but there was no sign of anyone nearby now. No sign of them leaving or anything else out of the ordinary. But the realization hit me like a punch in the gut. Whoever it was had been watching me, and they had been there the entire night, just out of my sight, circling my camp. I don't know why they hadn't done anything else, but the thought of it sent me into a panic. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, not even bothering to make sure everything was perfectly packed. I just wanted to get out of there. The whole way back to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the trees made my heart race. But there was nothing. Nothing but the silence of the woods. I haven't gone camping alone since that trip, and I don't think I ever will again. Even now, just thinking about it, I feel that same chill down my spine. Whoever it was, whether they were just some kind of sick person playing games or someone with worse intentions, they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew how to move silently, how to make sure I never saw them. And I'll never forget those muddy footprints circling my camp, the footsteps I heard all night, always stopping just when I tried to confront them. Something about that situation felt so wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there, like I was never meant to leave. If there's one thing I've learned from that night, it's that the woods aren't always as peaceful as they seem. And when you're alone out there, anything can happen. Anything at all. We had been camping for 2 days when it all started. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just a group of friends looking to disconnect from our busy lives and spend some time in nature. No cell service, no distractions, just us in the woods. It was peaceful at first, just what we needed. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call or the rustling of the wind in the trees. We set up camp near a small creek, and everything was fine for the first day. We brought a portable radio with us to pass the time in the evenings. It was a cheap one, not anything fancy, just one of those small battery-operated models that could pick up the basic AM/FM stations. On the second night, after dinner and a few drinks, we sat around the fire and turned it on to see what we could pick up. There was nothing much on the regular stations, just static, so we started turning the dial randomly to see if we could find something more interesting. At first, it didn't seem like anything was out of the ordinary. We laughed, joked, and tried to make sense of the strange sounds we were hearing. The static would cut in and out, and we'd get fragments of voices now and then, but it was so garbled we could barely understand anything. We figured it was just bad reception, or maybe the batteries were starting to die. It wasn't until we started hearing clearer words that we began to get uneasy. It started with just a few short phrases. I remember one of the first ones, "They know where you are." It was barely audible at first, almost like a whisper lost in the static. At first, we thought it was just interference, something harmless. But the longer we listened, the more the voices began to come through. They were more distinct now, more deliberate. Don't trust them. Stay inside tonight. It was the kind of thing that made you freeze for a moment. We all looked at each other, unsure of what to make of it. Was it a prank? Maybe some weird channel or station that was messing with us. But the voices, they didn't sound like radio hosts or anything normal. They sounded wrong. Like someone was trying to get a message through, but something was off. At first, we dismissed it. We laughed it off, tried to brush it away. We turned the dial again, and the voices stopped. We found another station, and the rest of the night went by quietly. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept hearing the words in my head, "Stay inside tonight." The next day, we went hiking during the day. It was a beautiful trail, and we enjoyed it, trying to forget about the strange occurrence from the night before. But when we got back to camp, the radio was still there, sitting on the log next to the fire pit. It was hard not to think about what happened, especially since the feeling in the air had changed. The wind had picked up, and the forest felt denser, like it was closing in on us. We didn't talk much about the radio. No one wanted to bring it up, but I think we were all thinking about it. It wasn't until nightfall that things really started to get strange. We sat down by the fire again, and one of us, Chris, I think, decided to mess with the radio again. This time, it wasn't just a few words. We picked up a full sentence, and it wasn't just static anymore. It was a voice, clear as day, like someone was right there with us. "Get out of the woods." We froze. It wasn't one of us, it wasn't a joke. It was a deep, raspy voice, almost threatening. The kind of voice that made your blood run cold. We all turned to look at each other, confused, but none of us said anything. Chris quickly turned the dial to another station, and for a few minutes, the radio was silent again. But it didn't stay that way. The static returned, but this time the words were louder, clearer, more urgent. "They know you're here. They're watching." That's when it really hit me. My heart started to pound. This wasn't a coincidence. There was no way it could be. Someone was sending these messages. But who? And why? We tried turning the radio off, but as soon as we turned it back on, the same voice came through. Don't trust them. They're coming for you. At that point, I think we all realized something was seriously wrong. This wasn't just a weird coincidence anymore. I don't know what it was, but something was out there, and it knew we were here. The voices weren't random, they were directed at us. We didn't know what to do. We debated packing up and leaving, but it was getting late, and none of us wanted to make the hike back in the dark. We tried to stay calm, but every time we heard those messages, it felt like the forest was closing in on us. The firelight flickered, and the shadows around us seemed to grow longer, stretching toward us. The worst part was when the messages started to get more specific. You're not alone. Come out. We know you're hiding. That last one hit me the hardest. We weren't hiding. We were sitting there, by the fire, in plain sight. But the voice made it sound like we were being watched, like someone was waiting for us to make a move. I don't know how much time passed after that. We were all on edge, jumping at every sound, every movement in the trees. No one spoke for a long time. We just sat there, staring at the fire, listening to the radio crackling in the background. Then, around midnight, it happened. The message came through again, only this time it wasn't a warning. It was a command. Leave the camp. Now. I don't think any of us hesitated. We grabbed our things, packed up as quickly as we could, and started to head out. I don't know what we thought we were running from, but we couldn't stay there anymore. It felt like we were being hunted. We made it back to the parking lot and into our cars. No one said a word. We just got in, started the engines, and left. As we drove away, the radio continued to crackle behind us, but we didn't dare turn it back on. We never went back to that spot. We couldn't. The feeling of being watched, the messages, the way the forest felt like it was closing in on us, it was too much. To this day, I don't know who was sending those messages. I don't know what they wanted or why they were following us. But I do know that something was out there in those woods, something that wanted us to leave. And I'm not ever going back to find out who or what it was. It happened on a Friday evening. I had just put my son to bed, and I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I had ordered some things online earlier that week. Maybe it was a late delivery. I got up and looked through the peephole. A man stood there in a brown jacket holding a small box. He had a baseball cap pulled low over his face, but he smiled when I opened the door, keeping the chain latched. Delivery 4. He glanced at a piece of paper in his hand. Mrs. Taylor? The name was wrong, but I figured maybe it was a mix-up with the delivery company. I think you've got the wrong house, I said. He chuckled nervously. Sorry about that. Could you just confirm the address? That's when I started to feel uneasy. The box didn't have a label on it, and he wasn't wearing any kind of uniform. I asked him which delivery service he was with, but he avoided the question, mumbling something about working with a third-party company. I don't think that's for me, I said, starting to close the door. His hand shot out and grabbed the edge of the door before I could shut it. Wait, he said, his tone changing. I think this might actually be for you. I froze. His smile was gone, and his grip on the door was firm. My heart started pounding, but I tried to stay calm. "Let go of the door," I said, trying to sound confident. Instead of listening, he pushed against the door, hard enough to rattle the chain. I leaned my weight against it, but I could feel him testing it, trying to force it open. "I just need to come in for a second," he said. His voice was steady, almost too calm, and it scared me more than if he'd been yelling. "I'm calling the police," I said, backing away from the door and grabbing my phone off the table. He stopped pushing and looked straight through the gap. "You won't," he said, his voice low and even. Something about the way he said it made my stomach drop. I dialed 911 anyway, but before I could hit call, he slammed his shoulder into the door. The chain held, but it groaned under the pressure. I screamed, dropping my phone, and ran to grab the baseball bat I kept in the corner of the living room. "Stop it!" I yelled, holding the bat in front of me like a shield. He didn't respond. The chain snapped with a loud crack, and the door flew open. He stepped inside, shutting it behind him, and for a second, we just stared at each other. He wasn't tall or particularly muscular, but there was something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. He looked determined. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, raising his hands like he was trying to calm me down. "Just stay quiet, and this will be over soon. Get out of my house." I screamed, raising the bat. He lunged at me before I could swing it, grabbing my wrists and forcing the bat out of my hands. I struggled against him, kicking and clawing, but he was stronger than he looked. He shoved me against the wall, pinning me there. "Where's the kid?" he asked, his breath hot against my face. I froze. "Leave him alone," I said, my voice shaking. His grip tightened, and he smiled with this slow, deliberate grin that made my skin crawl. "That's up to you." I knew I couldn't let him near my son. I'd die before I let that happen. Gathering every ounce of strength I had, I kneed him in the groin as hard as I could. He let out a grunt and stumbled back, giving me just enough time to grab the bat from the floor. This time, I didn't hesitate. I swung it with everything I had, hitting him square in the side. He yelped and fell to his knees, clutching his ribs. I didn't stop. I swung again, this time catching him on the shoulder. He cursed and tried to grab the bat, but I pulled it back and hit him once more, this time in the head. He collapsed onto the floor, groaning, but I didn't wait to see if he was down for good. I ran to the door, unlocked it, and bolted outside, screaming for help. A neighbor heard me and came running. I told him what happened, and he called the police while I stayed on the porch, shaking and trying not to cry. The man didn't come out of the house. By the time the cops arrived, he was unconscious on the floor, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. They took him away in handcuffs, and I later found out he wasn't a delivery driver at all. He'd been scoping out houses in the neighborhood for weeks, pretending to deliver packages as a cover. He had a record breaking and entering assault. That night, I slept in my son's room with the door locked and the bat by my side. I don't think I've ever felt so scared in my life, but I'm just grateful we made it out okay.